I was sold like a commodity in a Boston parlor, but I chose to be ruined in the mountains of Colorado. They call me a harlot for living with three brothers on a wild ridge, but for the first time in my life, I am finally free. This is the story of how a virgin bride escaped a golden cage to find a home in the heart of the storm. Before we dive into the legendary tale of the Virgin Bride of Devil's Ridge, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more epic sagas, and comment below with the city or country you are watching from today. Now let us go back to where it all began. Boston, 1875. The wedding dress hung in the corner of Rosalind Marchetti's bedroom, like a ghost waiting to claim her soul. White silk cascaded from padded shoulders, catching the gray November light that filtered through lace curtains, heavy with dust and propriety. It was beautiful. It was expensive. It was the kind of dress that made other women gasp with envy and reach out to touch the fabric with trembling, covetous fingers. Every stitch had been placed by the finest seamstress in Boston. Every pearl had been selected to catch the light at exactly the right angle. Every fold of fabric had been designed to transform the woman inside it into something magnificent and untouchable and ultimately decorative. And every single time Rosalind looked at it, she felt the walls of her elegant bedroom close in just a little tighter. Like the silk was not hanging on a frame but wrapping around her throat. Like the pearls were not ornaments, but weights sewn into a net designed to drag her down into deep water where no one could hear her scream. She stood before the full-length mirror that occupied the far wall of her room, studying the reflection of a young woman she barely recognized anymore. 24 years old, educated at the prestigious Preston Academy, where daughters of the wealthy were molded into perfect instruments of social advancement, fluent in French, accomplished in literature, proficient in music, particularly the piano, which she played with technical perfection and absolutely no joy, skilled in needlework, watercolor painting, deportment, in the delicate art of saying nothing while appearing to say everything. She was in every measurable way exactly what a young lady of quality should be. Everything a governess would need to teach the children of wealthy families. Everything necessary to secure what polite society called an advantageous marriage. Rosalind tilted her head slightly, watching how the pale morning light played across features that strangers often call pretty. Her eyes were the color of summer storms, that deep shifting blue that could turn from calm to turbulent in the space of a single thought. Her hair was the shade of ripe wheat in August, thick and lustrous, but pinned up now in the severe style that Aunt Prudence insisted upon, pulled so tight against her scalp that it created a faint, constant headache she had learned to ignore years ago. Her skin was pale as winter milk, so white it seemed almost translucent in certain light, the complexion of a woman who had never known the touch of honest sunlight because proper ladies did not expose themselves to such coarsening influences. Her hands were perhaps the most telling detail of all, soft as a child's, smooth as polished stone. Fingers that had never scrubbed a floor, never wrung out wash, never gripped anything heavier than a teacup or a book of poetry. Hands designed for displaying rings, for resting delicately on the arm of a suitable escort, for folding in a lap during interminable dinners where conversation flowed like molasses and meant approximately as much. She was a product, a commodity. 12 years of finishing school had taken a grieving, curious, adventurous girl and transformed her into a perfectly polished ornament, ready to be displayed in some wealthy man's parlor between the imported vase and the marble clock. Ready to smile at the right moments and speak at the right volume and produce children at the appropriate intervals, and never, not once, not ever to express a thought that had not first been approved by someone with more power than she possessed. And in exactly 2 days, the man who would own this particular ornament would be Aldrich Whitfield. The thought sent ice through her veins, not the clean cold of winter air or mountain snow, but something darker and more viscous. The cold of a cellar door closing, the cold of a key turning in a lock, the cold of understanding with perfect and devastating clarity that the rest of your life has already been decided and you were not consulted in the decision. Aldous Whitfield was 43 years old, a widower twice over, which in itself might have been unremarkable in an age when women died in childbirth with grim regularity and fever swept through cities like the hand of an indifferent god. But there were rumors about the first wife's death that polite society pretended not to hear. Whispered conversations that stopped when Rosalind entered rooms. Meaningful glances exchanged between older women who knew things they would never say aloud, because saying them would require acknowledging truths that threatened the careful architecture of their social world. His second wife had simply faded. That was the word people used. Faded. As if a human being could lose color and substance like a curtain left too long in the sun. She had been vivacious when Whitfield married her, bright and laughing and full of plans. Within 2 years, she was a shadow. Within 3, she was dead. The doctor said consumption. The servants, those who would speak at all, said something else entirely, though they said it only in whispers and only to each other, and only when they were absolutely certain no one of consequence could overhear. Rosalind had met Aldous Whitfield 7 times before their engagement was announced. 7 carefully orchestrated encounters at dinner parties and social gatherings where he had been positioned beside her with the strategic precision of a chess piece moved by an invisible hand. His hands were always damp when he touched her, always lingering too long on her waist during the rare moments when etiquette required physical contact, sliding down her back when he thought no one was watching, his fingers pressing into her spine through layers of fabric with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. His smile was the worst part, not because it was cruel, though she suspected cruelty lived behind it, but because it reminded her of something hungry and infinitely patient. The expression of a predator who knew with absolute certainty that his prey had nowhere to run. Who could afford to wait because the trap was already set and the walls were already closing, and the outcome was already determined by forces far more powerful than one young woman's quiet desperation? Aunt Prudence had arranged the match with the precision of a military campaign and the emotional warmth of a financial transaction, which in essence was exactly what it was. Aldous had money, Aldous had status, Aldous had the kind of social standing that could elevate the entire Marchetti name back to the heights from which it had fallen when Rosalind's mother committed the unforgivable sin of marrying for love instead of advantage. And Aldous was willing to pay a substantial reverse dowry for the privilege of acquiring Rosalind, the orphan niece, with no inheritance and no prospects beyond what her aunt chose to provide. It was by all accounts an excellent arrangement. Prudence said so at least 3 times a day, usually while examining Rosalind with the appraising eye of a horse trader inspecting merchandise. "The dress fits perfectly," she would say, running her fingers along seams and checking the drape of fabric across Rosalind's body. "You will look presentable. Aldous will be pleased." Presentable. Not beautiful. Not radiant. Presentable. Like a ledger balanced to the last penny. Like a house cleaned for inspection. Like a product packaged for sale. Rosalind wanted to scream. She wanted to rip the wedding dress from its frame and tear the silk to ribbons and throw the pearls out the window, where they would scatter across the manicured lawn like tiny moons fallen from a dying sky. She wanted to run through the house, slamming doors and breaking china and shouting all the things she had spent 12 years learning to swallow. Instead, she did what she always did. She turned away from the mirror and crossed to the window, resting her forehead against the cool glass, looking out over the gardens that stretched between the house and the iron fence that separated the Marchetti property from the street beyond. The gardens were beautiful. Of course they were beautiful. Everything about this life was beautiful on the surface. The flowers were arranged in geometric precision, every bloom planted to create patterns that could be admired from the upper windows. The hedges were trimmed to mathematical exactness. The gravel paths were raked daily by servants who moved through the landscape like ghosts, present, but invisible, essential but unacknowledged. And beyond those iron gates lay a world Rosalind had only read about in books. She had consumed those books the way a drowning person consumes air, secretly, hungrily, in stolen moments between lessons and social obligations, and the endless parade of dinners and teas and afternoon calls that constituted the life of a proper Boston lady. She had read about mountains that touched the sky so massive they made human endeavor seem absurd in wonderful and equal measure, about prairies that stretched to infinity, seas of grass where a person could walk for days without encountering another soul, about a wild frontier where a woman's past mattered less than her willingness to work, where the suffocating rules that strangled her here held no power over those brave enough to leave them behind. She thought about her parents then the way she always did when the cage felt especially tight. Richard Marchetti had been a school teacher, the son of Italian immigrants, who had crossed an ocean with nothing and built a life from raw determination and unshakable dignity. He was poor in money but rich in everything that actually mattered. Books lined every wall of their small house. Ideas filled every conversation at their dinner table. And love, the kind of love that does not perform or calculate or keep score, saturated every room like sunlight through clean windows. Elizabeth had been a society daughter raised in the same rarefied air that Rosalind now breathed. But Elizabeth had possessed something her younger sister Prudence never would: courage. The courage to look at the life that had been prepared for her, all silk and crystal and hollow propriety, and say no. The courage to choose a school teacher with kind eyes and calloused hands over a parade of suitable gentlemen with soft hands and cold hearts. The courage to walk away from money and statuses and family approval for the simple, radical privilege of being loved by someone who saw her as a person rather than a possession. They had lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city, and Rosalind's childhood memories were saturated with colors that her current life entirely lacked. The deep amber of afternoon light through kitchen windows, the rich brown of her father's leather-bound books, the warm gold of her mother's hair worn loose and free because Elizabeth Marchetti answered to no one about how she wore her own hair. And everywhere, the absolute certainty that she was cherished, not for what she could become or what she might produce or how she could be useful, but simply and completely for being exactly who she was. Then the fever came. It arrived in autumn the way death so often did, in those years carried on winds that smelled of fallen leaves in the first cold edge of winter. It took her father first. Richard Marchetti, who had survived poverty and prejudice and the daily indignities of a world that looked down on immigrant sons, was defeated in 6 days by an enemy too small to see. He died holding his wife's hand, his last words a whispered instruction to take care of their daughter, and a declaration of love so simple and direct that it needed no poetry to make it beautiful. Elizabeth lasted 3 weeks longer, 3 weeks of watching her mother deteriorate, becoming translucent and fragile, a candle burning down to its last inch of wax. She died on a Tuesday morning in November, and the last thing she gave her daughter was a pearl necklace and a sentence that Rosalind would carry in her heart for the rest of her life. "You are more than they will ever tell you that you are." Rosalind was 16 years old when she buried the last of them. She stood alone in the rain in a cemetery that smelled of wet earth and loss, watching 2 coffins descend into holes that seemed impossibly deep, while Aunt Prudence stood several feet away, holding an umbrella and complaining about the mud ruining her imported shoes. 8 years later, Rosalind still remembered the sound of dirt hitting coffin lids. Hollow, final. The sound of a door closing on everything warm and good and real. Aunt Prudence Hayes Marchetti had taken her in out of social obligation, not affection. She was Elizabeth's younger sister, a widow living on her dead husband's money and the bitter, corroding certainty that life had cheated her of everything she deserved. She looked at Rosalind and saw not a grieving child in desperate need of love and stability, but an investment opportunity. Raw material to be shaped and refined and eventually sold at a profit. And there was something else beneath Prudence's cold efficiency, something Rosalind had only recently begun to understand. Prudence had been in love once, before her arranged marriage to the elder Marchetti brother, before the life of calculated social climbing and strategic alliances. She had loved a young professor at Harvard, a man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers and a laugh that could fill a room. But her parents had forbidden the match, not wealthy enough, not connected enough, not suitable. Prudence had obeyed, had married the man chosen for her, had watched from across ballrooms as her sister Elizabeth did the very thing Prudence had been too afraid to do, choosing love over security, passion over propriety, freedom over the golden cage. And that choice, Elizabeth's choice, had festered in Prudence like a wound that would never heal. Not because she hated her sister, but because her sister's courage was a mirror that reflected Prudence's cowardice back at her every single day. Now Prudence looked at Rosalind and saw Elizabeth's daughter preparing to do the same thing, preparing to choose her own path. And Prudence was determined to prevent it, not out of cruelty exactly, though the effect was indistinguishable, but out of a twisted conviction that surrender was survival, that the cage was protection, that the rules which had strangled her own dreams were not the disease but the cure. "You will learn." Prudence had told Rosalind once, her voice carrying the absolute authority of someone who has confused bitterness with wisdom, that love is a luxury women like us cannot afford. Security is what matters. Position. stability. Everything else is sentiment, and sentiment is the enemy of survival. Rosalind had said nothing. She had learned by then that arguing with Prudence was like arguing with weather. Pointless and exhausting, and guaranteed to leave you soaked and shivering. The small inheritance Richard Marchetti had left his daughter, modest savings from a lifetime of teaching, disappeared into Prudence's accounts within the first year, spent on gowns and parties and the endless grinding machinery of social advancement. Rosalind watched her father's legacy evaporate into silk and champagne, and invitations to houses where no one cared about books or ideas or the particular quality of light through kitchen windows. Now Rosalind had nothing. No money, no property, no legal standing independent of her aunt's authority, no options that she could see in any direction she looked. Or so she had believed until 3 weeks ago. Rosalind moved away from the window and crossed to her writing desk, a delicate piece of furniture that had belonged to her mother and was therefore the only object in this house that Rosalind truly loved. She opened the leather-bound volume of Wordsworth's poetry that had been her father's most treasured possession, the one book she had managed to save from Prudence's systematic erasure of everything connected to Richard Marchetti's memory. The pages fell open to a familiar spot near the middle between verses about daffodils and wandering clouds, and the kind of natural beauty that Boston drawing rooms could never contain. And there, pressed between those gentle poems, like a seed waiting for spring, lay a torn rectangle of newsprint. Rosalind unfolded the advertisement and read it for the 100th time. The paper was already soft from handling the ink slightly smudged, where her fingers had traced the words again and again the way a believer might trace the words of Scripture. Mail order bride needed, Brennan Ridge Ranch, Colorado territory. 3 brothers on mountain ranch seek wife. Life hard, but honest. Woman must be independent, unafraid of difficulty, willing to build family in unconventional way. The words were simple, plain, the kind of language used by people who valued directness over decoration, who said what they meant because the mountains did not care about eloquence, and the weather would not wait while you searched for a more elegant phrase. The promise those words held was anything but simple. Rosalind had found the advertisement by accident. Pure chance. The kind of cosmic coincidence that makes you wonder whether the universe occasionally takes pity on the desperate and slides a door open in what had seemed like an impenetrable wall. A servant had used a page of the Boston Herald to line a tea tray, and Rosalind had spotted the advertisement while lifting her cup. Her eyes had caught on those words the way a drowning person's hand catches on a rope. Mail order bride needed. 3 brothers, mountain ranch, life hard but honest. Something shifted in her chest when she read those words for the first time. Not her heartbeat, though, that quickened. Not her breathing, though, that caught. Something deeper and more fundamental. A door opening in a room she had believed had no doors. A window appearing in a wall she had been told was solid and permanent and could never be breached. Colorado territory, 2,000 miles from Boston. A place where Aunt Prudence's connections meant nothing because the social networks that gave her power did not extend beyond the Mississippi River. Where Aldous Whitfield's money could not reach because wealth meant something different, in a land where survival depended on strength and skill and willingness to work rather than inheritance and reputation. Where Rosalind Marchetti could stop being a product and start being a person. 3 brothers on mountain ranch seek wife. She could do that. She had been trained for exactly that purpose, even if Prudence had envisioned a different application for that training. Rosalind knew literature and languages, mathematics, and music history and etiquette and household management. She could organize a home. She could educate children. She could be useful, could earn her place in the world through competence and effort rather than through the transaction of her body to a man who made her skin crawl. The phrase, unconventional way, should have frightened her. A woman of her education and background should have read those words and recognized them as a warning. 3 men seeking one wife. The mathematics alone violated every principle of proper society. The implications were scandalous. The reality would be worse than anything her sheltered imagination could construct. Instead, those words felt like salvation, like finding water in a desert, like hearing your own name spoken in a language you had forgotten you knew. She had written her response that very night, composing the letter by candlelight after the household had retired, choosing her words with care because she understood instinctively that these were not men who would be impressed by flowery language or social credentials. She described herself honestly, a woman of education and practical skills, accustomed to hard work, though she knew as she wrote it that her definition of hard work and theirs probably occupied different continents, willing to travel, eager to begin a new life. She did not mention Aldous Whitfield or Aunt Prudence or the wedding dress hanging like a ghost in the corner of her room. She did not mention the inheritance that had been stolen from her or the future that had been arranged without her consent. She simply presented herself as what she wanted to be, a capable woman seeking an honest position in a place where her past would not follow her. Then she slipped out of the house through the servants' entrance, moving through the November darkness with a racing heart and trembling hands, and posted the letter herself rather than trusting the household servants who reported everything to Prudence with the faithful devotion of well-compensated spies. The reply came 2 weeks later. 2 weeks of agony, 2 weeks of watching the mail tray at breakfast with desperate nonchalance, terrified that Prudence would notice her interest and investigate. 2 weeks of lying awake at night, calculating distances and costs and probabilities, running through scenarios in her mind the way a general might plan a campaign, except the territory she was planning to invade was her own future. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, hidden among invoices and social correspondence that Prudence sorted through each morning with the efficiency of a postal clerk. Rosalind had to wait until her aunt left for an afternoon call before retrieving the envelope from the silver tray, where it sat unremarkable and life-altering, bearing a Colorado postmark, and handwriting that was bold and slightly uneven, the penmanship of someone who held a pen the same way they held a hammer, or an axe as a tool rather than an instrument of elegance. She tore it open with fingers that would not stop shaking. Position is yours if you want it. Stagecoach ticket, waiting at station, come before mountain passes close for winter. We are 3 men living together. If that frightens you, do not come. No pleasantries, no reassurances, no attempt to make the offer sound more palatable or socially acceptable. Just facts laid out with the stark honesty of people who did not have time or patience for pretense. The signature at the bottom was simply 2 words, E. Dunhill. Rosalind had wanted to weep with relief. Instead, she pressed the letter against her chest and closed her eyes and stood absolutely still in the middle of her aunt's parlor, feeling the paper against her heart like a hand reaching out from 2,000 miles away to pull her towards something she could not yet see but desperately needed to believe existed. Then she dried her eyes, hid the letter inside the Wordsworth volume, and began to plan. The plan required money, This was the obstacle that had initially seemed insurmountable because Rosalind possessed exactly nothing in the way of personal funds. Every penny of her father's inheritance had been absorbed into Prudence's accounts. Her clothing, her books, even the writing desk that had belonged to her mother were technically Prudence's property under the legal framework that governed unmarried women's relationship to their guardians. Rosalind owned one thing of value in the entire world, the pearl necklace her mother had given her before dying. And she would rather die herself than sell it. But she knew where money could be found, specifically the $43 in cash that Aunt Prudence kept in the locked drawer of her writing desk for household emergencies. Rosalind had known about that drawer since she was 18 years old, when she had watched through a doorway as her aunt counted the bills with greedy, meticulous fingers, licking her thumb, before separating each note with the careful attention of a woman who understood that money was the only reliable form of power in a world designed to keep women powerless. She had also known, since she was 12, how to pick a simple lock. This was a skill she owed to a stable boy named Peter, a freckled, cheerful boy of 14, who had worked at the house next door during the last summer of her parents' lives. That summer, the last one that contained any real happiness, Peter had taught her several useful and entirely improper skills during long afternoons when she was supposed to be practicing piano. Lock picking, tree climbing, the proper way to whistle through 2 fingers, the art of walking silently on wooden floors. She had thought them useless talents then, party tricks to make the other children laugh, remnants of a childhood that ended when the fever came and took everything that mattered. Now one of those talents would be her salvation. 2 nights before her wedding to Aldous Whitfield, Rosalind Marchetti put her plan into action. She waited until the household was thoroughly asleep, until Prudence's snoring echoed down the hallway with the rhythmic regularity of a metronome, that nasal drone that Rosalind had listened to through thin walls for 8 years, and that she would never, God willing, hear again after tonight. She waited until even the servants had retired to their quarters in the upper floor, their candles extinguished one by one like stars going out. She waited until the old house settled into its nightly symphony of creaks and groans, the sound of wood and stone shifting in the cold, familiar noises that had been the backdrop of her captivity and would tonight become the soundtrack of her escape. The November darkness pressed against the windows like something alive and watchful. A thin moon hung in a sky full of racing clouds, providing just enough light to navigate by if you knew the house well enough. And Rosalind knew this house the way a prisoner knows their cell. Every floorboard that creaked, every door that squeaked, every shadow that moved, and every corner that stayed dark. She dressed in her plainest traveling clothes, a gray wool dress that would not attract attention in a crowd, sturdy boots that she had purchased secretly from a catalog 3 weeks earlier, telling the shopkeeper they were a gift for a servant, a dark cloak with a deep hood that could hide her face if necessary. She packed a small trunk with only the essentials, making choices with the ruthless efficiency of someone who understood that everything she left behind was gone forever. 3 more gray dresses, plain and serviceable, and nothing like the elaborate confections that filled her wardrobe. Undergarments. A few books, including the Wordsworth volume with the advertisement still hidden inside. The pearl necklace her mother had given her, wrapped in a handkerchief and tucked into the deepest corner of the trunk where it would be safe. She looked at the trunk when she had finished packing. So small, so modest, not much to show for 24 years of life. But it was hers. Every item chosen by her own hand for her own reasons. And that made it more valuable than every silk dress and crystal goblet in Prudence's over-decorated house. Then she crept down to the study. The stairs were the most dangerous part. 14 steps, and she had memorized which ones would betray her. Third step, left side creaked like a rusty gate. Seventh step, dead center groaned under any weight above a cat. 11th step, right side, had a loose nail that clicked against wood if you set your foot down too quickly. She navigated them all with the careful precision of a woman crossing a frozen lake, placing each foot with deliberate exactness, barely breathing, her heart hammering so loudly in her ears that she was certain the sound alone would wake the entire household. The study door was closed but not locked. Prudence never locked it because Prudence never imagined that anyone in her household would dare to enter uninvited. This was the confidence of a woman who had controlled everything and everyone around her for so long that the possibility of defiance had become genuinely inconceivable. Rosalind turned the handle and slipped inside. Moonlight filtered through the study windows, falling across Prudence's massive oak desk in silver strips that illuminated the wood grain and the brass hardware, and the small keyhole in the center drawer that separated Rosalind from her future. Her hands trembled as she extracted the thin piece of wire she had fashioned from a hairpin. She had practiced on her own bedroom door for 2 weeks, working the technique until her fingers could find the tumblers by feel alone. But practice and reality are different countries, and the reality of crouching before her aunt's desk in the dark, committing what the law would consider theft, sent waves of cold fear through her body that made her fingers clumsy and uncertain. The mechanism was simple, designed to keep out servants rather than determine thieves. A basic tumbler lock that yielded to patient pressure and careful manipulation. Rosalind worked the wire with shaking hands, feeling for the subtle click that would tell her the pins had aligned, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps that fogged slightly in the cold night air. The drawer opened with barely a whisper. Inside, exactly where she had known they would be, lay a neat stack of bills. Rosalind counted them quickly, her fingers moving with the speed of desperation. $43, enough for a stagecoach ticket, enough for meals along the way, enough barely to transport one woman in one small trunk across 2,000 miles of American landscape, from the only world she had ever known to a world she could not begin to imagine. She took it all, every bill. Her hands trembled with something more complex than simple fear. Guilt, yes, she was stealing. There was no other word for it, no euphemism that could transform this act into something more socially palatable. But the guilt was overwhelmed by something stronger. The cold, clear knowledge that this money represented her only chance at freedom. And the equally cold, equally clear knowledge that Prudence had already stolen far more from her. Rosalind's inheritance, her father's savings from a lifetime of dedicated teaching, had been consumed by Prudence within the first year. Thousands of dollars gone into dresses and parties and social campaigns that had nothing to do with Rosalind's welfare and everything to do with Prudence's ambition. The $43 in this drawer were a fraction of what had been taken from her. This was not theft. This was collecting a debt. She climbed back up the stairs with the money pressed against her chest. Third step left side, seventh step dead center, 11th step right side. Each one navigated with the same trembling precision as before, though now every step carried her closer to freedom rather than closer to crime. In her bedroom, she placed a note on her pillow. She had written it earlier that evening, choosing each word carefully, knowing they would be the last words she ever addressed to the woman who had controlled her life for 8 years. I cannot become what you want me to become. Please do not search for me. There was no signature. There was no need. Prudence would know who had written it, and she would know with the sickening certainty of a woman whose most valuable asset has walked out the door exactly what it meant. Then Rosalind Marchetti picked up her small trunk, pulled her dark cloak tight around her shoulders, slipped out through the servants' entrance at the back of the house, and vanished into the Boston night. The air hit her face like a slap. Cold and sharp and unimaginably fresh after years of breathing the recycled atmosphere of drawing rooms and parlors. She stood for a moment on the back step, feeling the wind move through her hair, tasting the salt tang of the harbor on her tongue, listening to the distant sound of a city that was still alive, even at this impossible hour. Above her, stars burned in a sky that seemed suddenly enormous. She had seen these same stars from her bedroom window 1,000 times, but they had always seemed distant and decorative like crystals hung from an invisible ceiling. Now they felt close, personal. As if they were watching her with approval, she picked up her trunk and started walking. The streets were nearly empty, a lamplighter making his rounds, his long pole casting shadows that danced like drunken partners. A drunk singing softly to himself on a park bench. A carriage rattling past with its curtains drawn, carrying passengers who did not see the young woman hurrying through the darkness with a stolen fortune and a desperate plan. Rosalind walked quickly but did not run. Running attracted attention. Running suggested guilt or fear or both. She moved with purpose, her boots clicking against cobblestones, her cloak billowing behind her in the November wind, and she kept her eyes forward because looking back might weaken her resolve, and she could not afford weakness now. Not now, not when she was so close. The train station was 12 blocks from Prudence's house. Rosalind covered the distance in 20 minutes, arriving just as the first gray hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. The station was already stirring, porters moving luggage, steam rising from engines. The particular energy of a place designed for departure, charged with the nervous excitement of people about to leave one life behind and step into another. She purchased her stagecoach ticket with steady hands and a voice that did not waver. A one-way passage west, Denver first, then the mountain routes into Colorado territory. The clerk behind the counter barely looked at her. Just another traveler heading west. Just another person with a past she did not want to discuss, and a future she was willing to gamble everything to reach. The stagecoach departed at 7 in the morning. Rosalind climbed aboard with her small trunk and settled into a seat by the window and watched as Boston began to slide past the glass. The brick buildings of Beacon Hill, the iron gates of the Common, the steeples of churches where she had sat through countless sermons about duty and obedience and the proper role of women in God's well-ordered plan. She watched it all recede into the distance, growing smaller with every turn of the wheels, and she felt something loosen in her chest. Something that had been wound tight for 8 years, so tight she had forgotten it was there until it began to release. She was afraid. Of course she was afraid. She was 24 years old, alone, heading into territory she knew only from books and advertisements. She was carrying stolen money and wearing plain clothes and running from a woman who would not forgive this betrayal and a man who would not accept this rejection. She had no idea what awaited her at the end of this journey. 3 men on a mountain, a ranch in the wilderness, a position that might not even exist. But as the last rooftops of Boston disappeared behind a curve in the road and the open countryside spread out before her like a promise written in autumn colors, Rosalind Marchetti felt something she had not felt since she was 16 years old, standing beside her parents' graves in the rain. She felt alive. The wedding dress still hung in her bedroom, white and expensive, and waiting for a bride who would never wear it. The ghost would have to find another soul to claim. Rosalind was already gone. The journey west took 6 days. 6 days of rattling stagecoaches that seemed designed to find every stone and rut and imperfection in the American road system and transmit each one directly into the base of Rosalind's spine. 6 days of dusty way stations where the food was questionable and the coffee was worse, and the beds, when beds were available at all, bore suspicious stains that Rosalind chose not to examine too closely. 6 days of watching America transform outside the windows of a wooden box on wheels, the landscape shifting and changing and opening up, like a story being told by a narrator who understood the power of gradual revelation. The first 2 days carried her through the world she knew. Eastern cities with their brick facades and cobblestone streets and the general atmosphere of settled, self-satisfied civilization. Philadelphia passed in a blur of church steeples and factory smoke. Pittsburgh announced itself with the glow of steel mills that lit the night sky orange and filled the air with a metallic taste that coated the tongue and burned the back of the throat. These were places that operated according to rules Rosalind understood. Places where the buildings were permanent and the social structures were rigid, and everyone knew their place in the machinery of proper society. Then the cities thinned out. The spaces between them grew wider. The buildings became smaller and less certain of themselves, as if even architecture lost confidence the farther it traveled from the coast. And somewhere west of Pittsburgh, in the rolling hills of Ohio, Rosalind looked out the window and saw something that made her breath catch in her throat. Horizon. Not the truncated horizon of a city where buildings and walls and fences chop the sky into manageable pieces. Not the manicured horizon of Prudence's garden, where iron gates and trimmed hedges defined exactly where the acceptable world ended and the unknown began. But true horizon. An unbroken line where earth met sky and nothing, absolutely nothing, stood between them. The land rolled out in gentle waves of brown and gold autumn fields, stretching so far in every direction that the eye eventually gave up trying to find the edge and simply accepted infinity. Rosalind pressed her face against the cold glass and stared. She had read about this, had imagined it during long afternoons in Prudence's parlor building, mental pictures from the words of writers who had traveled these roads before her. But no amount of reading could have prepared her for the emotional impact of seeing the world suddenly refuse to end, of understanding in a way that bypassed intellect and went straight to something deeper, that the cage she had lived in was not the entire world, that the world was vast and open and fundamentally indifferent to the rules and restrictions that had defined her existence. Something inside her expanded. There was no other word for it. Something that had been compressed and constricted for years, squeezed into a space far too small for its actual size, began to unfold. Not all at once, not completely, but enough that she could feel it happening, like blood returning to a limb that has been bound too long. The other passengers were a study in westward motion, each one carrying their own reasons for leaving the familiar behind. A Methodist preacher named Reverend Samuel Hicks and his wife Martha occupied the seat across from Rosalind for the first 3 days of travel. He was thin and earnest, with the slightly frantic energy of a man who believed God had given him a personal mission and a very tight deadline. Martha was quieter, steadier, the kind of woman who had learned to be the anchor while her husband chased divine wind. They were relocating to spread the gospel in mining towns, communities where men dug precious metals from the earth during the day and spent the proceeds on whiskey and women at night. The Lord's work is not done in comfortable places, Reverend Hicks told Rosalind, with the absolute conviction of someone who had never actually been to an uncomfortable place. It is done in the wilderness, among the lost and the desperate. Rosalind nodded politely and thought that she qualified on both counts. A young couple boarded in Indianapolis. Thomas and Sarah Brenner, both barely into their 20s with 3 children under the age of 5, who treated the stagecoach interior as a personal gymnasium. The eldest, a boy of 4 with his father's red hair and his mother's stubborn jaw, spent most of the journey asking questions that no one could answer. Why is the sky that color? Where do the birds go at night? How far is far? Thomas was heading west to claim land before the good parcels were gone, driven by the same hunger for space and opportunity that had been propelling Americans westward for generations. Sarah looked tired but determined, the expression of a woman who had married a dreamer and decided to dream alongside him rather than trying to wake him up. And there was a gambler. He boarded in St. Louis, tipping his hat to the assembled passengers with the practiced charm of a man who understood that first impressions were a form of currency. His name was Desmond Crane, and he was perhaps 40 years old with quick dark eyes that seemed to catalog everything they saw and filed it away for future reference. His clothes were better than the other passengers, but not ostentatiously so. His hands were clean and surprisingly delicate, the hands of a man whose livelihood depended on fine motor control and the ability to manipulate small objects with absolute precision. He tipped his hat to Rosalind every morning and called her miss, and never once tried to take advantage. This restraint, she suspected, was not born of moral principle, but of professional calculation. A gambler survived by reading people accurately, and Desmond Crane had apparently read Rosalind and determined that she was not the kind of woman who responded to casual advances. She appreciated his assessment, even if she questioned his motives. They were all seekers, all of them. Every person in that rattling wooden box was moving towards something they believed waited beyond the horizon. Land, souls, fortune, freedom. The specific object varied, but the fundamental impulse was identical. The conviction that the life they were leaving behind was insufficient, and the life ahead, though uncertain and possibly dangerous, held the promise of something essential that could not be found in the places they already knew. And if some of them were also running from pasts they preferred not to discuss, well, that was the unspoken bargain of westward travel. You did not ask about the weight someone carried, and they did not ask about yours. You accepted each other's carefully edited version of reality and respected the silences that surrounded certain topics, the way you would respect the boundaries of a neighbor's property. This was frontier etiquette, and Rosalind learned it quickly because it was exactly the kind of social contract she needed. She kept her own story simple when asked. She was a mail-order bride traveling to a new position. No family to speak of, no husband waiting at the end of the journey. Just a job and a chance and a future she was determined to claim for herself. The words came out smoothly practiced enough to sound natural, but vague enough to discourage follow-up questions. The landscape changed as the stagecoach pushed deeper into Kansas territory. The gentle rolling hills of the east gave way to plains so flat and featureless that the horizon became a perfect circle around them, as if they were traveling across the surface of an enormous drum. The grass here was different from eastern grass. Tall and golden brown, moving in the wind like water, creating waves and patterns that shifted constantly so that the prairie itself seemed alive and breathing and aware of their passage across its surface. Rosalind watched it for hours, hypnotized by the movement and the scale of it. She had never seen so much of anything in her life. So much grass, so much sky, so much empty space where a person could simply exist without being observed and judged and found wanting by the countless eyes of proper society. The vastness was both terrifying and liberating, the way jumping from a great height might be. The certainty that you had left solid ground behind and were now committed to whatever waited below. The young couple's children fell asleep against their mother's shoulder. The gambler read a dime novel with apparent concentration that Rosalind suspected was actually a cover for his constant surveillance of everything happening around him. Reverend Hicks composed sermons in a leather notebook, his lips moving silently as he rehearsed passages about redemption and divine grace and the importance of tithing. Martha knitted something that might have been a scarf or might have been a prayer made physical, her needles clicking with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. And Rosalind sat by the window and let the miles accumulate between herself and everything she had been told she was. On the fourth day, the mountains appeared. They rose from the western horizon like something from mythology, like the spine of some ancient creature buried beneath the earth, pressing upward against the sky with a force that made the atmosphere itself seem to bend around them. At first, they were just a smudge of blue-gray on the far edge of vision, easily mistaken for clouds or a trick of the light. But as the stagecoach continued its relentless westward progress, the smudge resolved itself into peaks. Individual, massive, breathtaking peaks that climbed into altitudes where the air itself must be different, thinner and sharper and cleaner than anything that existed at sea level. Snow already capped the highest summits, brilliant white against slopes of stone gray and deep forest green. The snow caught the late afternoon sunlight and blazed with a radiance that was almost painful to look at directly, as if the mountains were wearing crowns of pure light. Below the snow-lined pine forest climbed the mountainsides in dense dark waves, thousands upon thousands of trees that had been growing in these same spots since long before any European had set foot on this continent, since before Boston existed, since before the concept of Boston, of cities of civilization itself, had occurred to anyone. Rivers cut through valleys so beautiful they created a physical ache in Rosalind's chest. Water the color of liquid silver tumbled over rocks worn smooth by centuries of patient erosion, catching sunlight in their spray and throwing miniature rainbows into the cold mountain air. The sound of those rivers, audible even through the stagecoach walls when the road ran close enough, was unlike any sound Rosalind had ever heard. Not the controlled flow of a city fountain or the polite gurgle of a garden stream, but something wild and muscular and absolutely untamed. Water that answered to nothing but gravity and the shape of stone. This was nothing like Boston. This was nothing like anywhere Rosalind had ever been, or imagined, or read about, because even the best writers could not capture what it felt like to see mountains for the first time. To stand metaphorically, at least, since she was still sitting in a bouncing stagecoach at the foot of something so enormous and so ancient and so utterly indifferent to human ambition that it recalibrated your entire understanding of scale. In Boston, the tallest structures were church steeples and factory chimneys built by human hands to serve human purposes. Here, the earth itself had thrown up formations that dwarfed anything humans could construct. Formations that had existed for millions of years before the first human drew breath and would continue to exist for millions more after the last human was gone. In their presence, the social hierarchies and elaborate rules that had governed Rosalind's entire life seemed not merely oppressive, but absurd. Like arguing about the proper way to arrange deck chairs on a ship sailing through waters deeper than imagination could reach. Something in her chest expanded with every mile they traveled deeper into this untamed country. The compressed thing inside her, the thing that had begun to unfold when she first saw True Horizon in Ohio, opened further. Not painfully, but persistently, like a flower that has been kept in a dark room finally feeling the warmth of direct sunlight. Desmond Crane appeared beside her briefly as they changed horses at a way station nestled in the foothills. He gestured toward the mountains with his hat, his quick eyes reflecting the snow glow. "Beautiful, aren't they?" he said. It was not a question. "But don't let the beauty fool you. Those mountains kill people every winter. They don't care whether you admire them or not." "I know," Rosalind said. The gambler studied her face for a moment with that cataloging expression. Whatever he saw there seemed to satisfy him because he nodded once, tipped his hat, and returned to his seat without another word. The final leg of the journey was the most treacherous. The road, if it could be called a road at all, climbed into the mountains on a path that seemed to have been carved by a combination of optimism and insanity. It clung to cliff faces like something afraid of falling, a narrow ribbon of packed dirt and loose stone that wound around the flanks of peaks so steep that looking up from the valley floor made your neck ache and your stomach tighten with a vertigo that was purely psychological, but no less real for that. The stagecoach wheels rolled sometimes within feet of drops that fell away into nothingness, not the gentle slopes of eastern hills, where a tumble might leave you bruised and embarrassed, but fundamentally intact. These were vertical drops, sheer faces of rock that descended hundreds of feet to valley floors so far below that the trees down there looked like grass and the rivers looked like threads of silver laid across green cloth. A single miscalculation, a single moment of inattention from the driver, a single stone in the wrong place beneath a wheel, and the stagecoach and everyone inside it would simply cease to exist. Rosalind pressed her gloved hand against the window frame and watched the valley floor recede below them with each switchback turn. She should have been terrified. Part of her was terrified, the civilized part, the Boston part, the part that had been trained to avoid risk and seek safety and never venture beyond the protective walls of approved society. But another part of her, a part that was growing stronger with every mile, felt something else entirely. Exhilaration. The intoxicating, dangerous thrill of being in a place where the margin between life and death was measured in feet rather than years, where the consequences of failure were immediate and absolute rather than slow and suffocating. This is what being alive feels like, she thought. Not the careful, measured existence of Boston drawing rooms where every action was calculated and every word was weighed, and every day was essentially identical to the day before. But this raw, visceral engagement with a world that could kill you at any moment, and therefore demanded that you be fully present in every moment. The driver for this final leg was a man named Gus Pembry, perhaps 50 years old, with skin that had been weathered by sun and wind and altitude until it resembled the bark of an ancient tree. His teeth were stained with tobacco, and his eyes had the particular quality of people who have spent decades looking at distances so vast that close objects seem slightly out of focus. He had barely spoken to Rosalind since she boarded at the last town, communicating mainly in grunts and nods and occasional hand gestures that somehow conveyed all necessary information with remarkable economy. She found his silence comforting rather than rude. It meant he was concentrating. It meant his attention was on the road and the horses and the thousand small calculations required to guide a heavy vehicle along a narrow path above a lethal drop. Men who talked too much while doing dangerous work were men who did not fully appreciate the danger. And Rosalind preferred the company of someone who respected the mountains enough to shut up and pay attention. The November cold seeped through every crack in the wooden coach frame as they climbed higher. The temperature dropped with altitude, each 1,000 feet of elevation peeling away another layer of warmth until the air inside the coach was barely above freezing, despite the blankets and the body heat and the coal warmer that had been placed beneath the seat at the last way station. Rosalind huddled in her gray traveling dress and pulled her cloak tighter around her shoulders and felt the cold find every gap and seam and vulnerability in her clothing with the patient thoroughness of water finding cracks in stone. She thought about what awaited her at the end of this journey. 3 brothers who had advertised for a wife, a ranch in the mountains where no one knew her name or her family or the elaborate social machinery that had nearly ground her into dust. A chance to prove that Rosalind Marchetti was more than a commodity to be bought and sold and displayed in a wealthy man's parlor. She did not know what these men looked like, did not know their ages or temperaments, or what kind of life they had built in this wilderness, did not know if they would be kind or cruel patient, or demanding the sort of men who would treat a woman as a partner, or the sort who would treat her as a servant with different duties. The letter had told her almost nothing. 3 men, a mountain ranch, hard but honest work. Come if you are not afraid. She was afraid. She would have been a fool not to be afraid. But fear and willingness could coexist in the same body, and Rosalind had discovered over the past 6 days that the fear she felt heading toward an unknown future was a fundamentally different quality of fear from what she had felt heading toward a known one. Fear of the unknown carried within it the possibility of surprise, of discovery, of things turning out better than you dared to hope. Fear of the known offered no such comfort. Fear of Aldous Whitfield's damp hands and patient smile was a closed room with no windows and no doors, offering nothing but the certainty that tomorrow would be exactly as terrible as today. She chose the open fear. She chose the unknown. The sky had been growing darker for the past hour, clouds piling up against the peaks with a heavy bruised quality that spoke of serious weather moving in from the west. Not the gentle rain clouds of eastern skies, which announced themselves politely and departed on schedule like guests at a dinner party. These were mountain clouds, dense and dark and deliberately menacing, the kind that built against peaks like siege armies massing before an assault. Rosalind heard distant thunder rumbling through the mountains, a sound so deep it seemed to come from the earth itself rather than the sky. The sound rolled between the peaks and multiplied, echoing and re-echoing, until the entire mountain range hummed with it, a bass note so low it was felt in the bones rather than heard in the ears. The first drops of cold rain began to fall. Not gently, not gradually. They struck the coach roof like thrown pebbles, hard and sharp and insistent, each drop carrying the particular chill of precipitation that has formed at high altitude and traveled through freezing air before finding its target. Within minutes, the rain intensified into a downpour that turned the world outside the windows into a gray blur, a curtain of water so thick that the road ahead disappeared and the cliff edge became invisible, and the mountains themselves seemed to dissolve into formless mist. Gus Pembry's silence deepened. Rosalind could hear him speaking to the horses, now low, urgent words that she could not make out through the rain and the walls of the coach, but that clearly communicated the seriousness of their situation. The horses' pace slowed, Their hooves slipped on rock that was rapidly becoming treacherous as water transformed dust into mud and filled the ruts in the road with miniature streams that undermined the surface beneath the wheels. Rosalind closed her eyes. She had come too far to die on this mountain. 2,000 miles from Boston. 6 days of travel. 43 stolen dollars and a pearl necklace and a letter signed E. Dunhill. She was so close to her new life that she could almost feel it waiting for her beyond the storm patient and real and ready to begin. She let herself imagine freedom. Not the abstract concept she had dreamed about in Prudence's parlor, but something specific and tangible. A house in the mountains. Work that mattered. People who saw her as a human being rather than a decorative object. A life measured in accomplishments rather than appearances. She held that image in her mind like a candle against the darkness. That was when the horses screamed. Rosalind's eyes flew open as the stagecoach lurched violently to one side. The sound was not a whinny or a neigh or any of the normal equine vocalizations she had heard during 6 days of travel. This was a scream. Raw and primal and agonized, the sound an animal makes when it encounters something that triggers every survival instinct simultaneously. The sound of creatures pushed beyond the boundary of their endurance by something unseen and terrifying on the rain-slicked mountain road. The world became chaos. Spinning motion and splintering wood, impossible to process, impossible to escape, impossible to survive. The coach tilted past the point of recovery, balanced for one sickening moment on two wheels. And then gravity made its decision, and the decision was final. Rebecca saw the window frame rushing toward her face. She had time for exactly one thought, clear and sharp and absurdly calm in the midst of destruction. So this is how it ends. Then her head connected with solid oak, and an explosion of pain detonated behind her eyes, white and total and obliterating. And the last thing she heard before consciousness fled was the sound of wood breaking and metal tearing and horses screaming, and underneath it all, like a bass note beneath a symphony of destruction, the rushing wind of freefall. Then darkness rushed up to swallow her whole, in the stagecoach and the mountain and the storm, and Rosalind Marchetti's desperate bid for freedom all disappeared into black silence. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. Cold was the first thing. Not the polite chill of a Boston November morning, the kind that made you pull your shawl tighter and move closer to the fireplace. This was assault. Cold so intense it burned where it touched exposed skin, searing her left cheek with a sensation that her confused brain initially interpreted as heat before the nerve signals sorted themselves out and delivered the accurate message. Snow. She was lying face down in snow. Then pain. It arrived like an orchestra, tuning up each instrument, joining one at a time until the full ensemble was playing. Her head led the percussion section, throbbing with a deep, nauseating agony that pulsed in perfect time with her heartbeat, each pulse sending waves of blackness across her vision that threatened to pull her back under. Her ribs contributed a sharp, vicious counterpoint, the unmistakable signature of bones, that had been badly abused, fire lancing through her right side with every breath, every movement, every thought about movement. Blood ran hot down her temple, following the contour of her face with the lazy deliberation of something that had nowhere to be, and all the time in the world to get there. She felt it reach her hairline and begin to freeze there, crystallizing into tiny red gems that pulled at her skin as they solidified. Rosalind forced her eyes open. The effort was enormous, each eyelid weighing approximately the same as a cathedral door. The world swam into focus reluctantly, as if it resented being looked at and was doing its best to remain blurred and indistinct. She was lying on a slope of loose rock and scrub brush, perhaps 20 feet below the road. Above her, the edge of the road was visible as a dark line against the lighter gray of the storm sky, like a scar cut into the face of the mountain. Below her, the slope continued downward into a ravine of unknown depth, obscured by rain and mist and the general unwillingness of mountain terrain to reveal its secrets to the injured and the desperate. The stagecoach lay smashed against a cluster of boulders, perhaps 15 feet to her left. She turned her head toward it, each degree of rotation sending fresh bolts of pain through her skull, and what she saw made her stomach clench with a grief that cut through even the fog of her injuries. The coach was destroyed, not damaged or broken or in need of repair, but fundamentally and irreversibly destroyed. The wooden body had shattered like a matchbox thrown against a wall panels, splintered into jagged fragments that jutted at impossible angles. One wheel still spun slowly in the silence that followed catastrophe, its rotation describing a lazy circle against the gray sky, gradually slowing, gradually stopping, like the last heartbeat of something that had just died. The door hung from a single hinge swinging gently in the wind, with a creak that sounded like a small animal in pain. Luggage and supplies were scattered across the slope in a debris field that told the story of the impact. A trunk burst open, its contents spread across the rocks. A blanket caught on a thorn bush, flapping like a flag of surrender. Broken glass catching the dim light in ways that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Gus Pembury's body lay sprawled across a flat boulder 20 feet from the wreckage. Rosalind saw it and knew immediately. She did not need to check for breathing or feel for a pulse or perform any of the diagnostic procedures that were beyond her capability in any case. She knew because she had seen death before, had stood beside two coffins in the rain at 16 years old, and learned exactly what death's particular stillness looked like. The way a body became just an object when the animating force departed. The way limbs settled into positions that no living person would choose. The way the face went blank. Not peaceful exactly, but emptied like a house where all the furniture has been removed and the rooms echo with absence. Gus Pembury's neck was bent at an angle that told the entire story without requiring words. He had been thrown from the driver's seat when the coach went over his body following a trajectory determined by physics and momentum and the absolute indifference of gravity to human welfare. He had landed on stone, and stone had broken him, and that was the end of Gus Pembury's story. Rosalind stared at him for a long moment. This man who had carried her up the mountain in silence, who had concentrated on the road and the horses and the thousand small calculations required to keep them alive, who had been doing his job with the quiet competence of someone who understood that some tasks were too important for conversation. Dead now, unquestionably dead. His silence permanent rather than professional. The horses were gone. Their harnesses had torn free in the violence of the crash, and they had fled into the mountains driven by terror and the instinct that told them to run from destruction even when destruction was already behind them. Rosalind could see the tracks they had left in the muddy road above hoof prints, filling rapidly with rain, leading away into the mist, toward a freedom that was instinctive and absolute, and entirely unavailable to the human being lying bleeding in the snow below. Her small trunk had survived. She spotted it caught in a patch of scrub brush a few yards away, the leather scuffed and scratched, but the latches still holding the contents presumably intact inside their battered container. Rosalind fixed her eyes on it and began to crawl. Crawling was agony. Every movement of her torso sent her ribs screaming in protest, sharp electric bolts of pain that made her gasp and freeze, and then force herself to move again because stopping was not an option. Her arms trembled with the effort of pulling her body across loose rock, and her fingers were already going numb from the cold, losing sensitivity and dexterity in a slow surrender to the temperature that would eventually claim the rest of her if she did not move. She reached the trunk, pulled it close, opened it with fingers that fumbled at the latches for an agonizing 30 seconds before the mechanism yielded. Inside, her belongings were jumbled but intact. 3 gray dresses now wrinkled and pressed together. Undergarments. The book slightly damp but readable. And there in the deepest corner, wrapped in its handkerchief like something precious, being protected from a dangerous world, her mother's pearl necklace. Not much to show for 24 years of life. A few plain dresses. A handful of books. A dead woman's jewelry. A body full of injuries and a head full of dreams, and absolutely no idea how to survive the next few hours. The handkerchief she pressed against her bleeding temple was soaked through within minutes, the white cotton turning crimson with disturbing speed. Head wounds bled profusely. Rosalind knew this from books from the detached academic knowledge that was the only kind her education had provided. Knowing that the bleeding was normal did not make it less frightening. Knowing that she might have a concussion did not make the dizziness less disorienting. Knowing that she needed medical attention did not conjure a doctor from the empty mountain air. She forced herself to think through the fog of pain, to catalog her situation with the same methodical attention she would have applied to organizing a household inventory, because thinking in organized patterns was the only weapon she had against the chaos that threatened to overwhelm her. She was alone. There was no one within sight or earshot who could help her, and no guarantee that anyone would travel this road before the storm passed, which might be hours or days. She was injured. The head wound was serious, but not immediately fatal, assuming she could control the bleeding. The ribs were painful but functional. She could breathe, though each breath cost her. She could move, though each movement was an exercise in determination over physical protest. She was on a mountain road in Colorado territory with winter closing in. The temperature was already dropping as afternoon faded toward evening, and the storm showed no sign of weakening. Her traveling dress was torn at the shoulder, soaked with blood and melting snow. She was not dressed for exposure. She was not equipped for survival. She was a Boston debutante lying in the snow 2,000 miles from the nearest person who knew her name. No one knew she was here. Not a single person in the world knew the exact location of Rosalind Marchetti at this moment. Aunt Prudence thought she was hiding somewhere in Boston, probably sheltered by friends or servants who had helped her flee. The ranch, expecting a bride, would not begin to wonder about her absence for weeks, perhaps longer, because the advertisement had not specified an arrival date. Gus Pembry was dead. The horses were gone. The stagecoach would not be missed until it failed to arrive at the next station, and even then the search would begin at the wrong end of the road. This is how I die, Rosalind thought, with a clarity that was strange and terrible and oddly calming. Alone on a mountain, just like I have always been alone. The settings change, but the fundamental condition remains. Alone in a parlor, alone in a crowd, alone in the rain beside two coffins, and now alone on a mountain in a storm bleeding into snow that does not care about my blood. Thunder rumbled closer now. The sound no longer distant and atmospheric, but near and personal, the voice of the storm speaking directly to her with a message that was impossible to misinterpret. She looked up at the darkening sky and felt the rain intensify, cold drops mixing with the blood on her face, washing pink rivulets down her cheeks that might have been tears if tears were made of different material. The storm was coming fast, not approaching gradually, not building with the measured patience of eastern weather systems, but descending with the sudden violence of a mountain tempest that could drop temperatures 40 degrees in an hour and bury a road under 2 feet of snow before midnight. The kind of storm that killed as efficiently as the fall had killed Gus Pembry, without malice and without mercy, simply because killing was what storms did when you were in the wrong place without shelter. She had to move, had to find shelter or help or something, anything other than sitting here in the snow, waiting for the cold to finish what the crash had started. Waiting was not a strategy. Waiting was a method of dying that was slower and more painful than most alternatives. Rosalind forced herself to stand. The effort nearly sent her back to the ground immediately. Dizziness swept through her in a wave so powerful that the mountain seemed to tilt beneath her feet, the rocks and snow and scrub brush blurring together into a swirling mass that had no fixed point and no stable surface. She swayed, caught herself, swayed again. Her ribs screamed, her head pounded, her vision narrowed to a tunnel that showed only what was directly in front of her, everything peripheral dissolving into gray static. But she did not fall. She locked her knees and gripped the handle of her trunk and stood there swaying in the rain and the wind and the growing dark, and she did not fall. Because falling was surrender, and surrender was Aldous Whitfield's damp hands and Aunt Prudence's cold eyes and a wedding dress hanging in a corner like a ghost. And Rosalind Marchetti had not stolen $43 and traveled 2,000 miles and survived a stagecoach plunging off a cliff to surrender to a storm. She began to walk, one foot in front of the other. That was all she could manage. One step, then another, then another. Not thinking about distance or direction or destination, because those calculations required cognitive resources that were currently devoted entirely to the task of remaining vertical, just movement, just the mechanical repetition of placing one foot on solid ground and shifting weight forward and then doing it again. The road was above her. She had to climb back up to it, a scramble of perhaps 20 feet up loose rock and slippery mud that would have been challenging for a healthy person and was nearly impossible for a woman with injured ribs and a bleeding head wound. She fell twice. Both times the impact with the ground sent such intense pain through her body that she lay still for long seconds, face pressed into wetter earth, breathing in short gasps that fogged in the freezing air, waiting for the agony to subside enough that movement became conceivable again. Both times she got back up, When she finally reached the road, she stood for a moment looking in both directions, uphill and downhill. Both disappeared into rain and mist, within 100 yards the road curving around the mountain in both directions and vanishing into uncertainty. She had no way of knowing which direction led to the ranch. No way of knowing how far she had come or how far she had left to go. No way of knowing if the road led anywhere at all or simply wound through the mountains until it ended at a cliff or a pass that was already blocked by snow. She chose uphill, not because she had any rational basis for the choice, but because uphill felt like the direction of determination rather than defeat. Because climbing was harder than descending, and Rosalind had decided in the part of her brain that was still capable of abstract thought that if she was going to die on this mountain, she would die moving forward and upward rather than sliding backward into the comfortable embrace of gravity. The trunk grew heavier with every step. Rain soaked into the leather, adding weight to an object that was already testing the limits of her depleted strength. Her arms burned from carrying it. Her fingers ached from gripping the handle. Practical thinking suggested she should abandon it, leave behind the books and dresses, and save her energy for survival. But the pearl necklace was inside, and the Wordsworth volume and the advertisement that had brought her here, and these things were not luggage. They were identity. They were the evidence that Rosalind Marchetti existed as something more than a broken body bleeding on a mountain road. She kept the trunk. Time became meaningless. She might have walked for 1 hour or 3. The only measurement available was the rhythm of her footsteps and the pounding in her skull, both keeping a steady beat that she could synchronize into something resembling forward momentum. Step, throb, step, throb. The most basic possible music, the percussion of survival stripped of melody and harmony and anything that might be called beautiful. Her vision swam. The road blurred and doubled and occasionally disappeared, entirely replaced by spots of darknesses that expanded across her field of view like ink spreading on wet paper. She stumbled on a rock she had not seen, went down on her knees with a crack that sent lightning through both legs. The impact jarred her ribs, and she heard herself make a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, but existed in the territory between them, a noise that expressed everything she could not put into words. She struggled back up. Her hands would not stop shaking. The handkerchief was useless now, a sodden rag that could not begin to contain the bleeding. Blood ran freely down the side of her face, following the line of her jaw, dripping from her chin onto the collar of her gray dress, leaving a trail of dark spots that the rain immediately began to dilute. For the first time since the accident, Rosalind felt tears burn her eyes. Not from pain, though the pain was considerable and growing worse with every passing minute. Not from fear, though she was terrified in the deep cellular way that goes beyond conscious thought and operates at the level of biological imperative. But from the crushing, devastating weight of all of it, the years of trying, the endless, exhausting effort of trying to be good enough, proper enough, acceptable enough, trying to fit herself into shapes that were never designed to hold her, trying to smile at dinner parties where she wanted to scream, trying to make polite conversation about weather and fashion with people who had never read a book for pleasure in their entire decorative, purposeless lives, trying to be the commodity that Aunt Prudence needed her to be, while the real Rosalind, the one who loved mountains she had never seen and freedom she had never tasted, died a little more each day inside the polished exterior. And now this, after all of it, after the courage it had taken to steal and run and travel 2,000 miles alone, after the hope she had carried like a flame through 6 days of rattling stagecoaches and dusty way stations, after everything she had risked and lost and left behind, now this, dying alone on a mountain because she had dared to want something different. The tears came then, hot and salt and entirely useless, mixing with the blood and rain on her face until she could not tell which was which. She was crying for her parents, for the small house with the books and the laughter, for the girl she had been at 16 standing in the rain while dirt fell on coffins, for the woman she had tried to become, for the future she might never reach. She kept walking, one foot in front of the other. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. The sound cut through the rain and the pain and the fog of exhaustion like a blade through silk, definite and rhythmic and unmistakable. Not the chaotic scramble of the runaway horses, which had been all panic and no pattern. This was controlled, deliberate. The sound of a single horse being ridden at a careful pace by someone who knew these roads and respected the conditions. Rosalind's head snapped up. Hope surged through her exhausted body with a violence that made her gasp. It was almost painful, this sudden resurrection of expectation. She had been preparing herself for death, adjusting to the idea with the resigned pragmatism that extreme physical suffering eventually produces, and now Hope was demanding that she recalibrate everything in an instant. She tried to stand straighter, tried to call out to make some sound that would carry through the rain and alert the approaching rider to her presence. But her voice emerged as barely a whisper. Words dissolved into gasping breaths that fogged in the freezing air and vanished before they could travel more than a few inches from her cracked and bleeding lips. The horse and rider emerged from the rain like something from a fever dream, like an image produced by a brain that had been starved of hope for so long that it had begun to manufacture its own. He was enormous. Even sitting on his massive black stallion, Rosalind could tell he was easily 6.5 feet tall, maybe more. The horse itself was large, a powerful animal with a broad chest and strong legs built for mountain terrain, but the man on its back made it look almost normal-sized. He sat the saddle with the kind of easy, unconscious confidence that spoke of years in that position, his body moving with the horse's rhythm rather than against it, man and animal operating as a single unit that had long ago forgotten the distinction between rider and mount. Dark hair was plastered to his head by the rainwater running down his face in streams that he did not bother to wipe away because wiping away rain on a mountain was an exercise in futility. A thick beard covered the lower half of his face, not groomed or shaped, but grown out of practicality and perhaps indifference to appearance, the beard of a man who had more important things to do than stand before a mirror. And his eyes, visible even through the curtain of rain, were the color of winter ice, pale blue, startlingly light against his dark hair and sun-darkened skin, cold and clear and shockingly intense, like looking directly into a January ski. A scar ran from his right temple down to his jaw. A thin, pale line against darkened skin that spoke of violence survived. Not a neat surgical scar, but a ragged one, the kind left by something sharp that had been moving fast. It should have made his face frightening. Instead, it gave it character the way a crack in a mountainside gives the mountain character evidence of forces endured rather than flaws to be concealed. He wore rough work clothes beneath a long coat that was nearly black with absorbed water, heavy boots, no gloves despite the cold. His hands on the reins were large and scarred and completely bare, either impervious to the temperature or simply indifferent to discomfort in a way that suggested discomfort was such a constant companion that it no longer warranted acknowledgement. This was not a man from Rosalind's world, not a man from parlors and tea parties and afternoon calls where gentlemen wore pressed suits and spoke in measured tones and never allowed their physical presence to overwhelm a room. This was something else entirely, something raw and real and perhaps dangerous in ways she could not yet calculate, something that should have terrified her, something that instead made her feel for the first time since the crash like survival was not just possible but probable. The rider saw her, his ice-blue eyes locked onto her figure, standing in the middle of the road, swaying, bleeding barely upright, clutching a leather trunk like it was the last solid thing in a dissolving world. His expression did not change, did not register shock or alarm, or the kind of theatrical concern that a Boston gentleman would have performed upon encountering a distressed woman on a public street. He simply assessed. His gaze swept over her from head to foot and back again in one fluid movement that took perhaps 2 seconds and seemed to miss nothing. The blood on her face, the torn dress, the shaking hands, the trunk she refused to release, the way she stood slightly tilted, favoring her right side where the ribs were damaged, the way her eyes, through all the pain and exhaustion and blood loss, held his with an intensity that was either bravery or delirium. He dismounted in one fluid motion. The movement was graceful in a way that seemed almost impossible for a man his size, the kind of controlled physical economy that comes from performing the same action thousands of times until it becomes as natural and effortless as breathing. His boots hit the muddy road with a sound that was barely audible beneath the rain, and then he was moving toward her with long strides that covered the distance between them in seconds. He did not speak, did not ask questions or demand explanations or perform any of the social rituals that polite society required when encountering a stranger. He simply bent and scooped her up in his arms. Rosalind should have protested. Every rule she had ever been taught, every principle of propriety and appropriate behavior between unmarried men and women demanded that she protest, that she insist he put her down, that she assert her dignity and independence and all the other abstract concepts that seemed suddenly absurd when contrasted with the concrete reality of hypothermia and blood loss and the very real possibility of dying on a mountain road in Colorado. She did not protest because she was so cold, so tired, so far beyond the boundaries of endurance that the rules of polite society had become as meaningless as the conversation at one of Prudence's dinner parties. And because his body was warm, impossibly radiantly warm, heat poured from him like heat from a furnace surrounding her, penetrating the wet fabric of her clothes, reaching muscles that had been clenched against the cold for hours and convincing them one by one to release. She let her head fall against his chest, felt the steady beat of his heart through his shirt, strong and sure and alive. A rhythm so solid and reliable that it seemed impossible that the universe which produced it could also produce stagecoach accidents in mountain storms and death. He carried her to his horse as if she weighed nothing, lifted her into the saddle with one arm, and mounted behind her in a single smooth movement that would have seemed rehearsed if it were not clearly instinctive. One arm wrapped around her waist like an iron band holding her secure against his chest. The other hand took the reins, and they were moving the horse picking its way up the mountain road with careful steps, its hooves finding solid ground with the sure instinct of an animal that knew these paths the way Rosalind knew the hallways of Prudence's house. Safe, Rosalind thought, as consciousness began to slip away again. The words surfaced in her mind like a bubble rising through dark water. For now, for this moment, whatever comes next right now, I am safe. She drifted in and out of awareness as they climbed higher into the mountains. Sometimes she felt the horse's movement beneath her, the rhythmic sway of its walk transmitted through the saddle and through the body of the man who held her. Sometimes she heard the rain hammering against leather and flesh and stone, a percussion that should have been cold and miserable, but that registered instead as evidence of the world continuing to exist around her. Sometimes she was aware of nothing but the arm around her waist and the warmth of his body against her back, and the steady, unshakable heartbeat against her spine. She did not know how long they rode. Long enough for the light to fade from gray to charcoal. Long enough for the rain to shift from heavy to torrential and back again. Long enough for her consciousness to reduce itself to its most essential components: warmth, heartbeat movement, the knowledge that someone was holding her and had no intention of letting go. When full awareness returned, it arrived with the scent of wood smoke and the sound of a fire. Not the polite crackle of a parlor hearth designed to warm a room while remaining decorative and unobtrusive. This was the roar of a working fire fed with real logs and designed to produce real heat in a real house where warmth was not an amenity but a survival requirement. She was no longer on the horse. She was lying on something soft, something warm. A bed, she realized with the slow recognition of a mind that had been away for a while and was cautiously relearning how to process sensory information. A real bed with real blankets and real pillows that smelled of clean cotton and cedar wood. And there were voices around her, deep male voices, rumbling in the warm air, like distant thunder heard from inside a safe building. Where did you find her? In the road 3 miles down. Stagecoach went over the edge. Driver is dead. She is the only survivor. Looks like it. She is hurt. Head wound, maybe some ribs. We need to get her warm and dry before we worry about the rest. Rosalind forced her eyes open. The effort was enormous. Her eyelids heavy with exhaustion and dried blood, and the general reluctance of a body that had decided unconsciousness was preferable to the alternative. Light hit her pupils and she flinched, then blinked, then gradually allowed her vision to adjust. She was in a large room with rough wooden walls that had been hewn from logs and fitted together with the kind of craftsmanship that valued strength and durability over decoration. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall, rising from floor to ceiling in a column of fitted stone that must have taken months to construct. Flames roared in the hearth, enormous flames fed by logs the size of a man's thigh, throwing dancing shadows across the ceiling and filling the room with heat so intense and welcome that Rosalind felt tears prick her eyes simply from the relief of being warm. Three men stood near the bed, arranged in a loose semicircle that managed to be both protective and intimidating. All of them were watching her with expressions she could not quite read. Concern, perhaps. Curiosity, certainly. And something else. Something guarded and assessing and deeply careful, the expression of people who had learned through experience to be cautious about what they allowed into their lives. The one who had rescued her stood closest, still dripping rainwater onto the wooden floor, creating a small puddle around his boots that he either had not noticed or did not care about. His coat was still on, dark with water, and his ice blue eyes were fixed on her face with the same intensity she had seen on the road. Up close, the scar on his face was more visible, a thin white line that started at his temple and traced down across his cheekbone to his jaw, bisecting the dark stubble of his beard. Beside him stood another man, slightly less tall, but just as powerfully built and with the same dark hair, but clean-shaven, revealing a strong jaw and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to form a smile sometime around the same era that whatever caused the first man's scar had occurred. His eyes were hazel, a warm color that contrasted sharply with the coolness of his expression, and they studied her with a quiet intensity that felt less like curiosity and more like evaluation, like she was a problem to be solved or a threat to be assessed. The third man stood slightly apart from the others, leaning against the stone mantel of the fireplace, with his arms crossed over his chest. He was blond where the others were dark, his hair the color of summer hay, and his features were gentler, more refined, with a sensitivity around the eyes and mouth that spoke of education and introspection. He was no less imposing in size than the other two, broad-shouldered and obviously strong, but he carried his strength differently. Less like armor and more like something he had been given and was not entirely sure what to do with. His eyes were green, not the pale, watery green of eastern gardens, but a deep forest green that held something warm beneath its surface. Something that might have been concern, or might have been calculation, or might have been both simultaneously, the way that forest light can be both beautiful and obscuring at the same time. All three wore rough work clothes stained with evidence of their daily labor. Mud and animal musk, and the particular patina of honest sweat that accumulates on fabric worn by men who work with their bodies rather than sitting behind desks. All three were large in ways that made the substantial room feel slightly too small. And all three looked at her the way men look at something unexpected. Something that has appeared in their world without invitation and must now be dealt with one way or another. Rosalind tried to sit up. Her body immediately vetoed this decision. Pain lanced through her head, her ribs, her left shoulder, a coordinated assault of damaged nerves that sent her gasping back against the pillows, with stars exploding across her vision. Easy. The dark-haired man who had rescued her moved closer. His large hand pressed gently but firmly on her shoulder, keeping her down. The hand was warm through the blanket, calloused and scarred, the hand of a man who had spent his life gripping tools and reins and whatever else this mountain life required. But the pressure was carefully controlled, strong enough to restrain, but gentle enough not to hurt. "You took a hard fall. Do not try to move yet." His voice. She had not heard it on the road when he had communicated entirely through action rather than words. Now it rolled through the warm room like stone tumbling in a river, deep and rough around the edges, but carrying beneath its surface a current of something that was not quite tenderness, but lived in the same territory. The kind of voice that expected to be obeyed, not because it threatened consequences, but because it carried the natural authority of someone who was accustomed to making decisions and seeing them implemented. Rosalind found herself going still under his touch, whether from pain or exhaustion or something else entirely, something she did not have the energy or the vocabulary to examine. She could not have said. "Who are you?" Her own voice came out thin and reedy, barely recognizable as belonging to the same woman who had spoken French and debated literature and commanded servants in another lifetime, that was already beginning to feel like a dream she had once had about someone else. The three men exchanged glances. Some silent communication passed between them, quick and practiced. The kind of wordless conversation that only happens between people who have known each other so long and so deeply that spoken language becomes redundant. A question asked with a raised eyebrow, an answer given with a slight nod, a decision reached in the space between heartbeats. Then the one with his hand on her shoulder spoke. I am Everett Dunhill. His ice blue eyes held hers, and she noticed for the first time that they were not cold. Or rather, they were cold on the surface the way a frozen lake is cold on the surface. But beneath the ice there was depth and movement, and the suggestion of currents that ran strong and warm in places the surface could not reveal. This is my brother Briggs, he gestured to the clean-shaven man with the hazel eyes. And that is Orrin Lacey. We own Brennan Ridge Ranch. The words hit Rosalind with the force of a second impact. Brennan Ridge Ranch. The name from the advertisement. The destination she had traveled 2,000 miles to reach. The place she had stolen for and planned for and nearly died for. She was here. Against all odds and reason and probability, she was here. But something was wrong. The advertisement had mentioned children, had mentioned teaching, had implied a position that involved education and domestic management and the kind of work that a woman of her training was equipped to perform. But there are supposed to be children, she managed. Her voice was barely above a whisper, but in the warm silence of the room it carried clearly, young ones who need teaching. The expressions on the three men's faces shifted simultaneously. Something dark and unreadable passed between them, quick as shadows crossing the sun, a shared recognition of a subject they had clearly discussed before, and reached conclusions about that they were not entirely comfortable sharing. There are no children, Everett said quietly. His ice-blue eyes held hers without flinching, without apology, without any attempt to soften the impact of what he was saying. There never were. Rosalind stared at him. Her exhausted mind struggled to process his words, to fit them into a framework of understanding that had already been shattered by the crash and the pain and the long walk through the rain. If there were no children, then why had they advertised for a bride? Why had she traveled 2,000 miles? Why had she risked everything for a position that did not exist? I do not understand, she whispered. Briggs spoke then. His voice was rougher than his brother's, carrying an edge that could have been anger or protectiveness, or both the voice of a man who processed the world through suspicion, first and trust only after extensive verification. We did not place the advertisement. Our former housekeeper did, before we fired her for stealing. He paused, his jaw tightening visibly, muscles bunching beneath the skin. Dottie Skaggs. Apparently she wanted revenge. She placed advertisements for positions that do not exist, hoping to cause us trouble. The words landed on Rosalind like physical blows, each one striking a different part of her already battered emotional landscape. No position, no job, no reason to be here at all. She had stolen money from her aunt, fled across the country, nearly died on a mountain road, all for a lie. One vindictive woman's revenge against three men Rosalind had never met, expressed through an advertisement designed not to fill a need, but to create chaos. Then I came all this way for nothing. Her voice sounded hollow even to her own ears, empty in the way that a room sounds empty after all the furniture has been removed. The position does not exist. I have no qualm, no money to return east, no way to survive. The three men were silent. The fire crackled and popped in the hearth, sending sparks up the chimney into the storm above. Rain hammered against the windows. Wind pressed against the walls. And three men and one woman occupied a silence that felt like the space between one life ending and another beginning. Finally, Orrin spoke. His voice was different from the brothers, softer, more modulated, carrying the cadences of education and careful thought. The voice of a man who chose his words the way a craftsman chose his tools, selecting each one for its fitness to the task at hand. The position could exist if you are willing to stay. He uncrossed his arms and moved forward from the fireplace, and in the warm light, his green eyes held something that was neither pity nor calculation, but a genuine and careful consideration of possibilities. We do need help managing the household. The place has gone to hell since we fired Dottie. Rosalind's laugh came out bitter and broken, more cough than humor. But I am trained to teach children, not to keep house for three bachelors in the middle of nowhere. Everett's ice-blue eyes held hers, steady, unflinching, offering no comfort but also no deception. You are also a woman with no other options, injured on our mountain with nowhere else to go. We are offering you a position, room and board, and safety. He paused and something shifted in his expression, a door opening, just a crack, to reveal a room she could not yet see into. The alternative is, we give you money for a stage ticket back east once you are healed and you return to whatever you left behind. Whatever you left behind, the words hung in the air like smoke. And in that moment, Rosalind saw it all with perfect clarity. Not just the choice between staying and going, but the entirety of what each option meant. Going back meant Aunt Prudence, meant the cold parlor and the disapproving eyes in the endless, grinding campaign to mold her into something she was not. Meant Aldous Whitfield in his damp hands, in his patient, predatory smile. Meant the wedding dress hanging like a ghost. Meant a life sentence served in silk and crystal, comfortable and suffocating and utterly devoid of the one thing that mattered. Going back meant death. Not the quick, honest death of a mountain storm, but the slow death of a spirit confined to spaces too small to contain it. The death she had been dying for 8 years. Staying meant uncertainty, meant 3 strange men in a house in the wilderness, in work she had never done, in a future she could not predict. Meant scandal if anyone ever found out. Meant burning every bridge that connected her to the world she had known. Staying meant life, unknown and perhaps dangerous, but undeniably, irrefutably alive. I will stay, she heard herself say. The words came from somewhere deeper than conscious thought, from the same place that had read the advertisement and felt a door open and known with a certainty that transcended reason that her life was on the other side of it. At least until spring, when the pass is clear. By then, I will have saved enough to go somewhere else. Something that might have been satisfaction flickered across Everett's face, quick as lightning gone, before she could be sure she had seen it. Good. Now lie still while I clean that wound. You might have a concussion. Rosalind wanted to protest that it was improper for a man to tend her injuries, that the rules she had been raised with required a female attendant for such intimate ministrations, that a proper lady would rather suffer in silence than submit to the touch of a strange man's hands on her face. But exhaustion dragged at her like weights tied to her limbs, and the warmth of the bed was pulling her down into its embrace, and the pain in her head had reached a pitch where the promise of relief outweighed any consideration of propriety. She lay still as Everett's surprisingly gentle hands cleaned the gash on her forehead. His touch was careful despite his size, moving across her skin with practiced precision that spoke of years tending to injuries both human and animal, in a place where the nearest doctor was a day's ride away, and self-sufficiency was not a virtue, but a survival requirement. His fingers were scarred from hard work, calloused and strong, but they moved with a delicacy that seemed almost impossible from hands that large. Briggs brought water and clean cloth without being asked, anticipating his brother's needs with the silent efficiency of long partnership. Orrin added more wood to the fire, adjusting the logs with movements that were economic, and practiced the gestures of a man who had performed this same task 1,000 times and would perform it 1,000 more. They moved around her with a coordination that was almost beautiful. 3 men who knew each other so well that language had become largely unnecessary between them. A lifted chin from Everett and Briggs was already reaching for the bandages. A glance from Orrin and Everett was adjusting his position to give better access to the wound. They functioned as a single organism with 3 bodies, each part performing its role without instruction, because the roles had been established long ago and practiced daily until they were as natural as breathing. When Everett finished bandaging her head, he sat back on his heels and studied his work with the critical eye of a man who was his own harshest judge. The bandage was neat and firm, professional in its execution, if not in its provenance. It would hold. You will need to rest for a few days, he said. That was a hard hit. We will bring you food and check on you regularly. He gestured at the room around them. This is the spare room, right next to the kitchen. You will hear us moving around, but you will have privacy. Thank you, Rosalind whispered. The words felt inadequate, like trying to contain an ocean in a teacup. For saving me. For not leaving me to die. Everett's expression did not change. His face remained as impassive as mountain stone, as unreadable as the surface of a frozen lake. But something flickered in those ice-blue eyes, something that might have been warmth, or might have been warning, or might have been the complex fusion of both that happens when a man who has built walls around his heart encounters something that makes those walls feel less necessary and more dangerous simultaneously. We are not monsters, Miss Marchetti, he said. We are just men trying to survive on this mountain. Then he leaned slightly closer, and Rosalind caught the scent of him. Pine and leather and rain, and something underneath those surface notes that was purely masculine, purely physical. The scent of a body that worked hard and lived honestly, and did not attempt to disguise itself with the colognes and pomades that Boston gentlemen wore like olfactory armor. But I should warn you now before you commit to staying. This is not civilization. We do not follow Eastern rules here. We do not pretend to be gentlemen when we are not. If you stay, you will see sides of men you have probably never seen before. And if that frightens you, it is better you know now. What do you mean? Rosalind asked. Part of her was not sure she wanted to know, but a larger part, the part that had stolen money and boarded a stagecoach and survived a crash that killed the driver, needed to hear whatever he was about to say. Everett's gaze intensified. The ice in his eyes seemed to deepen, to take on layers that revealed more rather than less, like looking through clear water to the stones beneath. I mean, we work hard, we live rough, and we do not hide what we are. If you are looking for proper gentlemen who will treat you like a delicate flower, you have come to the wrong place. He paused. We will respect you. We will protect you. But we will not pretend to be something we are not. Rosalind met his eyes, saw something dangerous there, something that every lesson at the Preston Academy and every lecture from Aunt Prudence had trained her to recognize as a threat and avoid at all costs. Instead of fear, she felt something unexpected, a quiet settling in her chest, the sensation of arriving somewhere you did not know you were traveling to and recognizing it immediately as the place you were supposed to be. I am not looking for gentlemen, she said. I am looking for survival. Everett's smile was brief and sharp, appearing and disappearing so quickly that she might have imagined it. But in that fraction of a second, his face transformed. The severity softened, the ice warmed, and Rosalind caught a glimpse of the man who lived behind the fortress, and what she saw was neither monster nor gentleman, but something far more interesting. Then you will fit right in, he said. Rest now, we will talk more in the morning. The three men left, closing the door softly behind them. Rosalind lay in the warm bed, listening to their voices fade as they moved deeper into the house. She heard the bass rumble of Everett's voice giving instructions, the sharper tones of Briggs asking questions, the measured cadence of Orrin responding. Three voices weaving together into a conversation she could not decipher, but could feel the way you can feel music through walls even when you cannot make out the melody. She should be terrified. She knew this with the rational part of her mind that was still functioning. She was alone in the wilderness with three strange men who were larger and stronger than her. The job she had traveled for did not exist. She had nearly died today. She was injured and penniless and completely at the mercy of people she had known for less than an hour. But all she felt was a strange anticipation, a sense of standing at the edge of something brusque and unknown, the way she had felt when the mountains first appeared on the horizon. Not safe exactly, but alive. More alive than she had been in 8 years of safety and propriety in the careful, measured existence that Aunt Prudence had constructed for her. The governess who had left Boston was already gone, left behind on that mountain road with the overturned stagecoach and Gus Pembrey's broken body and the ruins of a plan that had been built on a lie. In her place was someone new, someone who did not yet have a shape or a name, just a clear understanding of what she was becoming. Someone who would have to be harder, stronger, more adaptable than anything the Preston Academy had prepared her for. Someone who could survive in a place where Eastern rules did not apply. Rosalind closed her eyes. The fire crackled in the next room. Rain hammered against the windows. And somewhere in the house, three men were discussing her future in voices she could feel but not hear. She slept, and she dreamed of ice-blue eyes and hands that could crush or protect with equal ease, of mountain peaks that touched the sky and valleys that stretched to forever, of a world where the word ruined did not mean what Boston thought it meant, of freedom, of home. By the end of her first week at Brennan Ridge, Rosalind had learned three things that would define the rest of her life. The mountains could kill you in 100 different ways, and they would not apologize for any of them. Wow. The men who lived here were not like any she had ever known. Not better or worse than Boston gentlemen, but fundamentally different in ways that went deeper than manners and clothing and the rules of polite conversation. And she was beginning to feel something for all three of them that no amount of Preston Academy training had prepared her to understand. That last realization terrified her more than the mountains ever could. The wounds healed faster than anyone expected, including Rosalind herself. The gash on her forehead closed cleanly within the first week, the edges of torn skin knitting together with the stubborn efficiency of a body that had decided to cooperate with survival, regardless of the mind's uncertainties. The wound left a thin scar hidden beneath her hairline, a permanent souvenir of the night she had arrived at Brennan Ridge more dead than alive. Her ribs remained tender but functional, aching when she moved too quickly or breathed too deeply or forgot herself and laughed, which happened rarely enough that the pain served as a kind of punctuation mark for the few genuine moments of joy that punctuated those early days. By the seventh day, she could move through the house without gasping at every step. By the 10th, she was itching to do something useful. By the 14th, she had declared herself recovered and begun the work that would transform both the household and herself. The house was larger than she had imagined, from her first blurred glimpse through pain and exhaustion in the fog of near death. It was a two-story log structure, built with the kind of craftsmanship that valued permanence over beauty, though it achieved both through the sheer quality of its construction. The massive stone fireplace rose all the way to the ceiling of the main room, a monument to the labor required to haul and fit each stone into place. Windows looked out over a valley so beautiful it stole her breath every time she passed them, framing views of snow-capped peaks and pine forests, and the silver thread of a river winding through the valley floor far below. The kitchen was equipped with a massive black iron stove that radiated heat like a living thing and required constant feeding to maintain its temperature. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with supplies that had been organized according to a system that appeared to be based on chaos theory. Solid wooden furniture filled the rooms, handcrafted pieces worn smooth by years of daily use, chairs and tables, and shelves that bore the marks of the tools that had shaped them in the hands that had used them. It was rough by Boston standards. No silk curtains softened the windows. No crystal chandeliers caught and scattered the light. No delicate china sat displayed behind glass doors for visitors to admire and envy. But there was something about this house that felt more real, more substantial, more honestly itself than any mansion Rosalind had ever entered. This was a home built for living rather than for showing off. Every surface bore the evidence of actual use. Every piece of furniture had been designed to serve a function rather than to impress a guest. Every room spoke of people who cared more about warmth than elegance, and more about durability than decoration. She began to learn the rhythms of the household, the daily patterns that governed life on a mountain ranch, with the same regularity and inevitability as the seasons that governed the land itself. Everett rose before dawn every day, pulling on he boots in the darkness and heading out to work with the cattle and horses. Before the sun had cleared the eastern peaks, he returned hours later smelling of animals and hay and cold mountain air, his clothes bearing the evidence of labor that would have exhausted most men before breakfast. At meals, he said little, eating with the focused efficiency of someone who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure. But his eyes missed nothing. Rosalind often felt his gaze on her when she moved through the kitchen or the main room, those ice-blue eyes tracking her with a watchfulness that was not threatening, but was intensely, continuously aware. There was something about Everett that commanded attention even in silence, especially in silence. He moved through the house with controlled power, every gesture deliberate, every action efficient, wasting neither motion nor energy on anything that did not serve a purpose. The scar on his face caught the firelight in the evenings, a reminder of violence survived, and the shadows in his eyes spoke of losses that Rosalind could sense but not yet name. Grief lived behind those ice-blue walls. She recognized it because she carried her own. Briggs was harder to read. He watched Rosalind with undisguised suspicion. During those first days, his hazel eyes tracking her movements with the wariness of a man who had been badly burned and was determined not to let fire near him again. He spoke to her only when necessary, his words clipped and economical, stripped of warmth or invitation. He was not cruel. He was simply closed, shut down, barricaded behind walls that had been built to withstand something specific and terrible. But Rosalind also discovered that he was an artist. She found the evidence on a Tuesday afternoon during her second week, while exploring the corners of the main room, that she had not yet had the energy to investigate. In a corner near the window that received the best light, stood an old easel, its wooden legs stained with years of accumulated paint. Behind it leaned stacks of canvases, some blank, some bearing images that made Rosalind stop and stare, with her hand pressed against her mouth. The paintings were beautiful. Not in the decorative way that the watercolors at the Preston Academy had been beautiful, carefully composed scenes designed to demonstrate technical competence and appropriate taste. These were beautiful the way a storm is beautiful, or a scar or a mountain face that has been carved by millennia of wind and ice, full of empty spaces and deep shadows and colors that ached with loneliness. Landscapes where the sky took up most of the canvas and the earth seemed small and humble beneath it. Studies of light falling across snow in ways that made the cold feel almost warm. A portrait of a horse standing alone in a field, its head turned towards something beyond the frame, something the viewer would never see. She caught him sketching one afternoon sitting by the window with a pad balanced on his knee and a pencil moving across the paper with quick, sure strokes that seemed to bypass conscious thought entirely. His hazel eyes were soft in that moment, unguarded, focused on something only he could see. And in that unguarded moment, Rosalind glimpsed the man behind the walls, a man of tremendous sensitivity who had chosen to hide that sensitivity behind gruffness and suspicion because the world had taught him that tenderness was a vulnerability, and vulnerability was a death sentence. She backed away before he noticed her watching, but the image stayed with her, the artist in the body of a mountain man hiding beauty behind barricades. Orrin was the easiest to know and perhaps the most surprising. He had education. Rosalind recognized it immediately the way you recognize a shared language when you hear it spoken in a foreign country. She heard it in the precise construction of his sentences, in the literary references he dropped into casual conversation, with the easy familiarity of someone who had absorbed great books so thoroughly that they had become part of his natural vocabulary. She saw it in the volumes scattered throughout the house with his name written inside the front covers in careful, elegant handwriting. Shakespeare and Milton and Keats, Wordsworth and Byron and Shelley. Not the reading material one expected to find in the home of Colorado ranchers, and certainly not in the quantity that filled the shelves and end tables and windowsills of Brennan Ridge. He was the most willing to talk. During her recovery in the early days of her work, Orrin would sit with her for extended periods, explaining how the ranch operated, describing the seasonal rhythms of mountain life, sharing stories about the years he and the Dunhill brothers had spent building this place from raw land and raw determination. His green eyes were kind when he spoke, genuinely kind, not with the practiced kindness of Boston gentlemen who had been trained to simulate warmth, but with the real warmth of a man who had spent years without someone to talk to and was grateful for the opportunity. He told her about his past in pieces, the way you might reveal a landscape by opening shutters one at a time. He had come from Boston, he said, watching her face to see if the connection registered. His family was wealthy and cultivated, and completely indifferent to the existence of a third son who had refused to follow the path they had laid out for him. First son got the business, second son got the law practice. Third son got whatever was left over, which in Orrin's case was the freedom that comes from being so thoroughly dismissed that no one cares what you do with yourself. He had wandered west at 20 years old, carrying nothing but books and a broken heart, and the particular kind of loneliness that belongs to people who have been surrounded by family their entire lives without ever once being seen. He drifted through mining towns and cattle towns and railroad towns, working whatever jobs were available, sleeping wherever he could find shelter, searching for something he could not name but would recognize when he found it. He found it at Brennan Ridge, or rather he found Everett and Briggs, and they found in each other the family that blood had denied them. Three men who had each been broken in different ways, discovering that the broken pieces fit together. "They are my true family," Orrin told Rosalind one evening, his voice carrying the quiet conviction of absolute certainty. "And I hope if you stay long enough, you will understand why." She was beginning to understand. She was beginning to see that these three men were bound together by something deeper than partnership or friendship or even the brotherhood they claimed. They functioned as a unit, a family forged by choice rather than birth, and the bonds between them were stronger for having been chosen deliberately rather than imposed by accident of blood. But then, and she was beginning to understand that if she stayed here, she would be entering that unit, not as an outsider looking in, but as a new element being incorporated into a structure that had been complete in itself and was now somehow making room for something it had not known it needed. The kitchen was where she made her first stand. Dottie Skaggs had clearly been incompetent long before she turned vengeful, and the kitchen bore the evidence of years of neglect disguised as work. Flour stored next to kerosene, sugar next to lye soap, dried provisions jumbled together without regard for type or expiration, creating an archaeological record of meals past that was more horrifying than informative. The massive iron stove was caked with grease so thick it had developed its own topography, and the pots and pans were crusted with burns that spoke of a woman who had treated cooking as an adversarial process. Rosalind attacked the chaos with the kind of focused determination that Aunt Prudence had always tried to direct towards social climbing, and Rosalind had always wanted to direct towards something real. She inventoried every item in the pantry, creating lists with the same methodical precision she would have applied to cataloging a library. She discarded what had spoiled, and it was a considerable amount. She reorganized what remained according to a system that made sense, grouping items by type and usage, placing frequently needed ingredients within easy reach and rarely used items on higher shelves. She scrubbed surfaces until they gleamed, discovering beneath the layers of grime and grease that the kitchen was actually quite well designed. She learned to operate the massive iron stove without setting anything on fire, a process that involved several near disasters and one spectacular failure involving cornbread that emerged from the oven resembling a piece of volcanic rock. She began cooking meals that were simple but edible, improving with each attempt as she learned through practice what cookbooks had only described in theory. The men noticed. They said little because these were not men who communicated approval through words. But Rosalind saw the way Everett nodded almost imperceptibly when she served biscuits that were actually fluffy, a nod so slight that a casual observer would have missed it entirely, but that Rosalind recognized as the highest praise this particular man was capable of offering. She saw Briggs reach for seconds of a venison stew that had turned out surprisingly well, his hazel eyes betraying a flicker of surprise that he quickly concealed behind his usual mask of guarded neutrality. She saw Orrin smile when she remembered, without being told, that he liked his coffee with sugar but no cream. Small victories, but they felt like more than their size suggested. They felt like the first bricks in a foundation being laid for something she could not yet see, but could feel taking shape beneath her. She learned their individual preferences with the attention to detail that made household management possible. Everett drank his coffee, black and strong enough to strip paint. Briggs despised onions with a passion that seemed wildly disproportionate, and that Rosalind suspected had a story behind it that she might someday be told. Orrin would eat anything set before him, but had a particular fondness for fresh bread that bordered on religious devotion. All three consumed food in quantities that initially astonished her, their bodies burning through calories with the relentless efficiency of furnaces fed by the endless labor of ranch work. The days fell into patterns that became rhythms, that became eventually the heartbeat of her new life. She woke before dawn to start fires and prepare breakfast. She cleaned and organized while the men worked outside. She prepared lunch, which they often ate quickly between tasks. She worked on dinner through the afternoon, learning through trial and error, an occasional spectacular failure what worked and what did not. By evening, she was exhausted, but it was a good exhaustion. The tiredness of useful work rather than the deadening fatigue of meaningless social obligations. For the first time in 8 years, Rosalind fell asleep each night, knowing that her day had mattered, that the work she had done had been real and necessary and valued by real people rather than performed for appearance and judged by artificial standards. And that knowledge was worth more than all the silk dresses in Boston. 1 month into her time at Brennan Ridge, something began to change. Rosalind noticed it first in the way Everett watched her. His ice-blue eyes would follow her movements across a room, lingering on her hands as she worked on her face, as she concentrated on the loose strands of hair that escaped her pins as the day wore on. He would hold her gaze a moment too long before looking away, and in that moment before the ice closed over again, she could see heat beneath the surface. She noticed it in Briggs. He had started sketching more frequently, his pencil moving across paper whenever she was nearby, and the sound of graphite on parchment had become the background music of her afternoons. She did not see what he drew. He kept his sketchbook angled away from her line of sight, with the protective instinct of a man who understood that what he was creating was a confession. She noticed it in Orrin, the way he found reasons to stay inside when the other two went out to work, The way conversations that should have lasted 5 minutes stretched to 30, then 60, then the entire afternoon. The way his green eyes held hers with an intensity that went beyond friendliness and into territory that had no name in the vocabulary of a Boston debutante. And she noticed it in herself. The way her pulse quickened when one of them entered a room. The way she had started wearing her hair down more often, telling herself it was simply more comfortable, knowing that this was not the whole truth. The way she chose her more flattering dresses each morning, claiming the others needed mending, aware that the claim was a fiction designed to disguise a desire she was not yet ready to name. Something was building. She could feel it the way you feel a storm gathering beyond the mountains, pressure accumulating in the atmosphere until the air itself becomes heavy and electric and charged with the promise of transformation. Everett taught her to ride. He stood behind her in the saddle, his hands covering hers on the reins, guiding her grip and her posture, and the subtle shifts of weight that communicated intention to the horse beneath him. His body was solid against her back, radiating heat that she felt through every layer of clothing, and his breath came warm against her ear as he spoke instructions in that deep, rumbling voice. She found it difficult to concentrate on the lesson. Briggs showed her his sketchbook one afternoon, approaching her after supper with the hesitant determination of a man who had spent hours arguing with himself about whether this was wise and had finally decided that wisdom was overrated. Inside were dozens of portraits of her. Rosalind cutting bread, her hands dusted with flour. Rosalind reading by the fireplace, her face lit by amber light. Rosalind laughing at something Orrin had said, her head thrown back and her eyes bright. Rosalind looking out the window with an expression she did not recognize as her own. Something yearning and open, and so vulnerable that seeing it rendered in pencil and shadow made her heart contract. She stood frozen before those sketches, unable to speak. Then she looked up and found Briggs standing in the doorway, watching her with an intensity that had nothing guarded about it, nothing suspicious, nothing protected, just raw, unshielded feeling laid bare in the space between them. They stared at each other across the room in silence that said more than words could have. Then Briggs turned and walked away without speaking, and Rosalind understood that what he had shown her was not a sketchbook, but a declaration. Orrin read poetry to her by firelight on winter evenings, his cultivated voice giving new life to verses she had studied in school but never truly heard. Keats and Shelley and Byron, words about beauty and passion, and the exquisite pain of wanting something so intensely that the wanting itself becomes a kind of possession. She closed her eyes and let the poetry wash over her, feeling it resonate in places she had not known she had. When she opened her eyes, all three men were watching her. Three different faces, three different expressions. But beneath the differences, the same thing. The same hunger carefully held in check. The same reverence disguised as patience. The same waiting. The tension was building towards something, and Rosalind could feel it approaching with the same inevitability as the winter storms that swept down from the peaks. Then came the night that changed everything. Not with words or declarations or any of the romantic gestures that novels had taught her to expect, but with wolves. The blizzard hit in mid-January with a violence that made every previous storm seem like a rehearsal. Temperature dropped to 40 below in the first hour and kept falling. Snow fell so thick and fast that the world beyond the windows became a solid wall of white, a howling void that erased the mountains and the valley and every feature of the landscape, until nothing existed beyond the circle of warmth created by the fire in the walls. On the second night, Rosalind heard the howling. Not the wind, though. The wind was howling, too, screaming around the corners of the house with a fury that rattled the windows and pushed drafts through every crack and seam. This was different, deeper, more deliberate, a sound that rose and fell with its own rhythm, carrying information in its cadences that the human ear could interpret even without understanding. Hunger, desperation, the particular madness that seizes wild things when winter pushes them past the boundaries of their endurance. Wolves, driven down from the high peaks by the severity of the storm, forced into lower elevations where food was scarce, and the presence of livestock created an irresistible gravitational pull. By the third morning, Rosalind could see their tracks from the kitchen window. Paw prints in the snow circling the barn, and the livestock pens in patient patterns that spoke of intelligence and coordination and the calm certainty of predators who understood that patience was more effective than speed. The tracks multiplied each night. 5 sets became 10. 10 became more than she could count. On the third night, the wolves attacked. The sound that woke her was not howling, but screaming. Horses screaming the same primal sound she had heard on the mountain road when the stagecoach went over, and the recognition of that sound sent her heart into her throat before her conscious mind had fully engaged. She was out of bed and running through the house before the thought could intervene. Everett and Briggs were already gone, their boots and coats missing from the hooks by the door, and she could hear gunfire from the direction of the barn, sharp cracks that split the howling darkness like lightning bolts aimed at the earth. Oren stood at the front door with a rifle, his face grim in the lamplight. "Stay inside," he said, not asking, telling. Rosalind did not stay inside. She grabbed the revolver that Everett had taught her to use during her riding lessons, a heavy piece that kicked hard when fired, but that she had learned to handle with a steadiness that had surprised all three men. She ran to the back door, the one that faced the chicken coop and the secondary fence line, because if the wolves had attacked the barn from the front, the back was unguarded. She was right. A wolf came through the gap in the fence like gray smoke, silent and enormous, moving with the fluid economy of a creature designed by millennia of evolution for exactly this purpose. Rosalind saw it in the moonlight that filtered through breaks in the storm clouds, saw its eyes catch the light and glow with pale fire, saw its body coil as it spotted the henhouse and calculated the angle of attack. She raised the revolver, steadied her hand, breathed the way Everett had taught her, and fired. The shot caught the wolf in the shoulder, spinning it sideways. It yelped a sound more surprised than pained, and then it was gone, scrambling back through the gap in the fence and vanishing into the white darkness with a speed that seemed impossible for an injured animal. But wolves, Rosalind would learn, were built to survive damage that would cripple lesser creatures. More gunfire from the barn, shouts that she recognized as Everett's voice giving commands with the calm authority of a man who had been in danger before and understood that panic was the most lethal threat in any crisis. Then silence. A silence that stretched and stretched until it became unbearable. Then Everett's voice, distant but clear. "They are gone. Check the stock." They lost 2 cattle that night. The wolves had pulled them down before the men reached the barn, and there was nothing to be done for animals whose throats had been opened by predators operating on the far side of desperation. But the horses survived, including the foal born earlier that winter, the one they had saved during the breech birth that felt like a lifetime ago. The chickens survived because Rosalind had been at the back door with a revolver and the willingness to use it. Afterwards, in the kitchen with coffee brewing and blood still visible on Briggs's forearm, where a wolf had raked its claws through his coat sleeve and into the flesh beneath, Rosalind cleaned and bandaged his wound. Her hands were steady, steadier than they had been the night she picked the lock on Prudence's desk, steadier than they had been when she boarded the stagecoach in Boston. She cleaned the torn skin with warm water and applied salve with the same careful precision she had learned from watching Everett tend her own wounds weeks earlier, and she felt Briggs go very still beneath her touch. She looked up and found his hazel eyes watching her from inches away, and for the first time there was nothing guarded in them, nothing suspicious, nothing held in reserve. Just warmth, just gratitude, just the naked vulnerability of a man who had been touched with tenderness and did not know how to protect himself against it. His hand came up slowly and covered hers where it rested on his bandaged arm, large fingers closing gently over small ones. He did not speak, neither did she. They held each other's gaze in the warm kitchen, while the storm raged outside and the coffee pot bubbled on the stove, and the distance between strangers and family contracted by another immeasurable degree. Then Briggs released her hand and looked away, and the moment passed. But something fundamental had shifted in the architecture of their relationship, a load-bearing wall removed to reveal a larger room behind it, and they both knew it, and they both knew the other knew it, and neither of them said a word. That night, after the wolves and the gunfire and the blood and the bandaging, Rosalind lay in her bed and understood with perfect clarity what was happening to her. She was not falling in love with one man. She was falling in love with 3, with Everett's strength and buried tenderness, with Briggs's fierce sensitivity hidden behind barricades of suspicion, with Oren's gentleness and education, and the loneliness he had carried for 20 years before finding this place. She was falling in love with all of them, and it should have been impossible, and it should have been wrong, and it should have frightened her. It did not frighten her. It felt like coming home. The conversation happened the next morning. All four of them around the kitchen table, coffee growing cold, the winter light falling through windows that still bore scratches from the wolves' assault on the walls. They told her their stories, not the edited versions she had received in pieces over the preceding weeks, but the full, unvarnished truth. Each man laying his scars on the table like cards in a game where the stakes were everything. Everett spoke first, his wife Lorelei and his daughter Ivy taken by winter fever 7 years before. He had been hunting 2 days' ride from home. When he returned, they were already dead. Lorelei still holding Ivy in her arms. He dug their graves himself in frozen ground. It took 3 days. His voice did not break as he told the story. It had moved beyond breaking into a territory where the pain was so old and so thoroughly integrated into the structure of his being that it no longer required expression. It simply was, part of him, like the scar on his face, like the ice in his eyes. Rosalind reached across the table and placed her hand on his, her small, pale fingers resting on his scarred, calloused palm. She did not plan the gesture. It came from a place deeper than planning, from the part of her that recognized grief in others because she carried so much of her own. Something changed in Everett's eyes as he looked down at their joined hands. A fracture in the ice. Not large, not dramatic, but visible like the first crack in a frozen lake when spring begins its slow, patient work. Briggs spoke next. Engaged 5 years ago to a woman named Marguerite, beautiful and charming and eloquent in her declarations of love. She left him the week before their wedding, ran off with a banker from Denver, took half his savings when she went, left nothing behind but a portrait he had painted of her and a capacity for trust that had been shattered so thoroughly that Briggs had spent 5 years trying to reassemble the pieces and was not certain he had succeeded. "That is why you did not trust me at first," Rosalind said quietly. Briggs met her eyes. His jaw was tight, the muscles working beneath the skin, but his voice was steady. "You have proven yourself different. You stayed through the winter, worked beside us, showed your strength 100 times. I was wrong to doubt you." Orrin told his story last, the Boston family that had treated him as surplus inventory, the father who communicated primarily through disapproval, the mother who communicated primarily through absence, the siblings who communicated not at all. 20 years of being invisible in a house full of people, followed by a desperate westward flight that ended when he found two men on a mountain who looked at him and actually saw someone worth seeing. "They are my true family," Orrin said, his green eyes steady and certain. "And now you are too." Then Everett leaned forward and said the words that would define the rest of Rosalind's life. "We share everything, work, responsibility, decisions. If you become part of us, truly part of us, you would belong to all three. Not to one man, to all three." The room went silent. The fire crackled, the wind pressed against the walls, and Rosalind Marchetti, who had been raised to believe that a woman's value was determined by her attachment to a single suitable man, looked at three unsuitable men and saw her future. "I will think about it," she said, "but I want you to know that I am not afraid. I have been afraid of many things in my life. Aunt Prudence, Aldous Whitfield, the life that was planned for me. But you know, you saved my life, gave me a home, treated me like a person instead of a commodity. That means more than you will ever know." The decision came on a night in late January when the blizzard returned with renewed fury and the temperature dropped so low that the water in the kitchen bucket froze solid between supper and bedtime. Three men stood before Rosalind in the firelight and asked the question that had been building since the moment Everett lifted her from the snow on a mountain road. "Do you want to belong to us? Truly belong?" Rosalind thought about the wedding dress in Boston, about Aldous Whitfield's damp hands, about Aunt Prudence's cold calculations, about the years of pretending to be something she was not. Then she thought about the warmth of Everett's arms when he carried her from the road, about Briggs's sketches, each one a love letter drawn in graphite and shadow, about Orrin's poetry and his kindness and the way he made her laugh even on the hardest days. "Yes," she said, her voice was steady as mountain stone. "I want to belong to you, all of you." What followed was private. It belonged to four people and the fire and the storm and the mountain that sheltered them. When the first gray light of dawn crept through the windows, Rosalind lay warm and safe and profoundly changed, surrounded by three men who had claimed her heart completely. She had been ruined by every standard of polite society, ruined thoroughly and absolutely, and without the slightest possibility of redemption. But lying there in the dawn light, feeling their warmth around her, Rosalind thought that perhaps ruined was just another word for free. The weeks that followed were the happiest of Rosalind's life. During the days, the rhythms continued. She cooked and cleaned and organized. The men worked outside. The ranch functioned. But the quality of everything changed. There was warmth now in places that had been merely functional. Laughter where there had been silence. Connection where there had been careful distance. They told her more of themselves during long winter nights by the fire. Everett spoke about Lorelei and Ivy, and Rosalind saw the frozen grief in him begin to thaw, slowly, painfully, the way a frozen limb returns to life with sensation that is agonizing and wonderful in equal measure. "I was not there to protect them," he whispered one night, his face turned away from the light. "I should have been there." Rosalind touched the scar on his face, tracing its length with gentle fingers. "You could not have defeated a disease, Everett. You are not God. You are just a man who did his best." Something locked behind those ice-blue eyes for 7 years began slowly and painfully to release. Briggs showed her the portrait he had painted of Marguerite. It was technically brilliant and emotionally devastating, capturing a face that held cruelty beneath its beauty, the way a sheathed blade hides the edge. He had torn it apart once Rosalind could see the lines where the canvas had been ripped and then carefully, painstakingly reassembled, as if he could not bring himself to completely destroy the evidence of his own pain. "I hate her," Briggs said, "but I am also grateful. If she had not betrayed me, I might have married her, lived a comfortable, dishonest life in Denver, would never have come to this mountain. Never met you." Orrin told her more about his Boston family, the house where he had grown up surrounded by expensive things and emotional poverty, the particular cruelty of being ignored rather than mistreated, because at least cruelty acknowledges your existence. "They gave me everything except the one thing I needed," Orrin said, "to be seen. Everett and Briggs see me, and now you see me too." They were becoming a family. Unconventional. Scandalous. Impossible by every standard Rosalind had ever been taught to respect. But real. Loving. Hers. Then 6 weeks after that first night, the threat arrived from the east, like a hand reaching across 2,000 miles to drag her back into the cage. The supply wagon driver brought a letter from town, and Rosalind recognized the handwriting on the envelope before she even took it from his hand. The precise, critical script of Aunt Prudence. Each letter formed with the controlled pressure of a woman who approached even penmanship as an exercise in authority. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal. "Rebecca, I know where you are and what you are doing. Dottie Skaggs was kind enough to inform me of your disgraceful situation. Living unmarried with 3 men like a common harlot, you have humiliated the Marchetti family completely. Mr. Aldous Whitfield has graciously agreed to overlook your indiscretion if you return immediately. I have hired a Pinkerton detective to ensure your safe return to Boston. He will arrive within the week. Do not make this more difficult than it needs to be." Rosalind read the letter 3 times, each repetition sending her blood running colder. She looked up to find all 3 men reading over her shoulder, their faces hardening simultaneously, 3 jaws tightening with the synchronized precision of men who had identified a threat and were already calculating how to neutralize it. "Let her come," Briggs said flatly. "We will send her back." "You do not understand," Rosalind shook her head. "My aunt has connections. She could bring the law, claim I am mentally unsound, force me back against my will. Not if you are married." Orrin's voice was quiet but carried the weight of a solution that had been waiting to be spoken. The room went silent. Everett and Briggs turned to stare at him. "Legally, she is protected if she is any of our wives." Everett looked at Rosalind. Then slowly, deliberately, he went to one knee. This man who commanded every room he entered, who moved through the world with the controlled power of a force of nature, knelt on the wooden floor of a log house in the Colorado mountains and looked up at her with eyes that held no ice at all. "Rosalind Marchetti, I cannot give you normal. I cannot give you society's approval. I cannot even promise you the kind of life your aunt would consider respectable. But I can promise to protect you, provide for you, and must love you until my last breath. Marry me legally. Let me give you that protection." "What about Briggs and Orrin?" Rosalind's eyes filled with tears. "We will have our own ceremony," Briggs said, his rough voice unexpectedly gentle. "Private, real. The legal marriage is just paper to protect you, but in our hearts, you are wife to all of us." 2 weeks later, a traveling preacher named Reverend Clement Oakes performed a simple ceremony in the ranch house. Rosalind wore a white cotton dress she had sewn herself, plain and honest, and nothing at all like the silk ghost that had hung in her Boston bedroom. Everett placed a gold band on her finger engraved on the inside with 3 initials, EBO. After Reverend Oakes pronounced them husband and wife, Everett kissed her. Then, to the Reverend's undisguised horror, Briggs kissed her, then Orrin. "We are unorthodox," Orrin told the scandalized preacher with a slight smile, "but we are honest." That night, after the Reverend had departed at a pace suggesting he feared for either his soul or his safety, they held their own private ceremony. Each man made vows to Rosalind. Each gave her a personal token. Everett's mother's locket, Briggs's favorite knife, the one he had carried since he was 15. Orrin's grandmother's pearls, brought from Boston in a velvet pouch that he had carried across 2,000 miles of American landscape. And Rosalind promised to love all 3 of them for as long as she lived. The peace lasted 1 week. Then the window shattered at midnight. Gunfire lit up the darkness and strobing flashes that turned the bedroom into a nightmare of shadow and light. Glass exploded inward in a shower of glittering fragments that caught the muzzle flashes and threw them back in 1,000 directions. Rosalind dove for the floor as the bullets punched through the wooden walls, each impact sounding like a fist striking a door. Everett and Briggs moved with the coordinated speed of men who had prepared for exactly this scenario. Rifles appeared in their hands as if conjured from the air. They took positions at the shattered windows and returned fire with the calm, methodical precision of experienced marksmen who understood that accuracy mattered more than volume. Orange shielded Rosalind with his body, pressing her flat against the floor and covering her with his own mass, and she felt the impact of his heartbeat against her back, fast but steady, the heart of a man who was afraid but had decided that fear was irrelevant. The attack lasted less than 5 minutes. Then the raiders retreated into the night, their horses carrying them away from the return fire they had not expected from a ranch they had assumed would be easy to intimidate. At dawn, they found the evidence: tracks from 4 horses, shell casings from professional weapons, and a note pinned to the barn door with a knife that was clean and new and expensive. Mrs. Prudence Marchetti offers $1,000 reward for Rosalind. Marchetti returned unharmed to Boston. She will not stop. Rosalind stared at the note with blood cold in her veins. She does not know who she is dealing with, Everett said quietly, his hand resting on his rifle. They fortified the ranch. Boarded windows, barricaded doors, set watches that rotated every 4 hours, each man sleeping in shifts while the others stood guard. Rosalind learned to shoot the rifle with deadly accuracy, her hands steady on the weapon despite the constant hum of fear that vibrated through her body like a plucked wire. The Pinkerton agents circled like wolves, a comparison that was not lost on any of them. Tracks appeared in the snow each morning. Movement flickered at the tree line. The constant, patient pressure of professionals who were being paid well enough to be thorough. But the siege brought them closer. They became a true unit, each person essential to the whole. Rosalind stood watch alongside the men, refusing to be sheltered. She had fought wolves. She could face men. 3 weeks into the siege, something unexpected happened. A man crawled to the front door of the ranch in the middle of a snowstorm, leaving a trail of blood in the white. His name was Amos. He was young, perhaps 25, with the face of someone who had chosen his profession for the money and was now learning what the money actually cost. He had been shot not by the Brennans, but by his own colleagues, who had decided he was a liability after he voiced objections to their plan of assault. Briggs wanted to leave him in the snow. Everett was undecided. Orrin said nothing and waited for Rosalind. "Bring him inside," she said. They brought him inside. Rosalind cleaned and bandaged his wounds, working with the same steady hands that had bandaged Briggs after the wolf attack, and she saw in Amos's eyes the bewildered gratitude of a man who had been shown mercy by the people he had been paid to destroy. When the fever from his wound broke 2 days later, Amos told them the truth. It was not Aunt Prudence who had hired the Pinkertons. It was Aldous Whitfield. The room went very still. Rosalind felt the blood drain from her face as Amos explained, his voice rough from fever and shame. Whitfield did not want Rosalind back out of wounded pride or romantic attachment. He wanted her back because of money. specifically an investment that Rosalind's father, Richard Marchetti, had made years before his death, a small stake in a mining concern that had since become enormously valuable. The investment was structured so that its proceeds could only be accessed by Rosalind upon her marriage. Whitfield had discovered this and arranged the engagement specifically to gain legal control of the money through matrimony. Aunt Prudence did not know about the investment. She had arranged the marriage for social advancement and the reverse dowry, never suspecting that the real prize was a fortune she did not know existed, hidden in financial instruments she did not understand. Left by a son-in-law she had spent years trying to erase from memory. Your father was smarter than any of them knew. Amos said, his voice carrying a respect that had nothing to do with his assignment and everything to do with the story he had discovered while researching his target. He made sure the money could only go to you, not to your aunt, not to any husband who married you against your will. To you. Rosalind stared at him. Then she started laughing. Not the bitter, broken laughter of a woman who had lost everything, but the full, rich laughter of a woman who had just discovered that her father, dead 8 years, was still protecting her from beyond the grave. Richard Marchetti, the poor school teacher, with ink on his fingers and love in his heart, had outsmarted them all. Amos, grateful for his life and moved by a conscience he had tried to suppress, agreed to return to town and testify against Whitfield's scheme. Everett escorted him to the edge of the property and watched him ride away, and something in his posture suggested that for the first time since the siege began, he believed it might actually end. The final battle came 3 days later during a storm that descended with the fury of a mountain range that had decided enough was enough. The remaining Pinkerton agents, unaware that their colleague had defected, made their assault under cover of wind and snow, and the assumption that 4 people trapped in a ranch house could be overwhelmed by professionals with superior numbers. They were wrong. Rosalind discovered that she was pregnant 2 days before the attack. She had suspected for a week, but confirmation came when she was sick behind the barn for the 3rd morning in a row, and Oren found her there, his face cycling through fear and joy and wonder in the space of 3 seconds. Life does not wait for safety, he said, pulling her close. This child is a gift. And when she told Everett and Briggs, both men's faces transformed. The same cascade of emotions: fear for the danger, joy for the miracle, wonder at the fact that life insisted on asserting itself even in the midst of war. The baby changed everything. They could not sustain a siege indefinitely, not with a child coming, not with the future demanding attention that the present was consuming. So when the Pinkertons came through the storm, 4 people were waiting for them. 4 people who fought with the desperation and the ferocity that only comes from protecting something irreplaceable. Rosalind stood at the back window with her rifle, her pregnant belly pressed against the wall, sighting down the barrel with steady hands. She fired methodically the way Everett had taught her. Breathe, aim, squeeze. The battle lasted 20 minutes that felt like hours. When it ended, 2 Pinkerton agents lay wounded in the snow, and the others had retreated into the storm, dragging their casualties through drifts that were already erasing the evidence of the fight. No one in the ranch was seriously hurt. A graze on Briggs's arm, a cut on Oren's cheek from flying glass. Rosalind untouched the child inside her, untouched, protected by walls and by 3 men who had positioned themselves between her and every line of fire. The Pinkertons never came back. The 2 wounded men made it to Silver Creek and told a story that turned the entire town against them. Hired to kidnap a pregnant woman from her legal husband, attacking a ranch in the dead of winter, trying to drag a wife from her home by force. The citizens of Silver Creek, frontier people who valued personal freedom, the way Eastern people valued social status, were appalled. The Pinkertons were run out of town. Amos testified before a territorial judge. And Aldous Whitfield's scheme collapsed like a house built on lies and greed, which was precisely what it was. A letter came from Harriet Yardley, the doctor's wife, who had befriended Rosalind during a supply trip to town. The news it contained tasted like spring water after a long thirst. Aunt Prudence's campaign had failed completely. The scandal had destroyed her standing in Boston society. Whitfield had been exposed and publicly disgraced. Several prominent women had written letters defending Rosalind's right to choose her own life. And her uncle Bradford, Prudence's own brother, had made a public statement that cut through the social machinery like a blade through silk. Any woman brave enough to build a life in the territories has more courage than most Boston debutantes. That seemed to break Prudence. The cost had exceeded what even her formidable will could sustain. She gave up. Rosalind read the letter 3 times. Then she looked at her 3 husbands and started laughing. Pure joy uncontaminated by fear or bitterness or the memory of everything she had survived to reach this moment. "It is over," she said. "We won." Spring came elated to the mountains that year, as if winter wanted one last word before surrendering the stage. But when it finally arrived, it transformed everything. Snow melted in torrents that filled the rivers and turned the valley floor into a shimmering expanse of new green. Animals emerged from dens. Birds returned from wherever birds go when the world becomes uninhabitable. And Rosalind's belly grew round and taut with the promise of new life. The baby came in early September, arriving 2 weeks ahead of schedule on a night when a thunderstorm split the sky with a violence that seemed appropriate for the occasion. The labor was long and difficult and terrifying. The baby positioned wrong breech, and for hours that felt like years, it seemed they might lose everything they had fought so hard to protect. But Everett, drawing on years of delivering foals and calves in this same barn, in this same valley, on this same mountain, managed what no Boston doctor could have done. He turned the baby with hands that were gentle and certain and guided by something deeper than medical training. By love. By the desperate, fierce, absolute refusal to lose another child. When the baby finally arrived screaming his outrage at the world with lungs that seemed far too powerful for a body so small, all 4 of them wept. "It is a boy," Everett said, and his voice broke on the word boy, the way a dam breaks when the water behind it becomes too powerful to contain. "We have a son." They named him Rowan. A boy who would grow up knowing he belonged to 3 fathers and 1 mother, and that love was not diminished by being shared, but multiplied beyond any measurement that mathematics or theology or polite society could devise. 40 years later, Rosalind stood beside Everett's grave on the ridge that bore their name. He had died peacefully in his sleep at 75, his hand resting on the pillow next to hers, his face relaxed in death into an expression she had not seen in life, the face of a man who had finally completely set down every burden he carried. Briggs stood on one side of her, Orrin on the other. Both men were old now, their hair more silver than dark or gold, their bodies bearing the evidence of decades of mountain labor. But they remained strong. They remained hers. Around them gathered the family they had built together. Rowan at 41, tall and broad, carrying echoes of all 3 fathers in his face and his bearing. His wife beside him, their 2 children clinging to her skirts. The twins, Marigold and Petra, at 37, named in memory of Everett's lost daughter, Ivy, each with husbands and babies of their own. Calloway at 25, Linnea at 23, Shepard at 18, the youngest, standing at the edge of adulthood with the same mixture of fear and determination that his mother had carried when she boarded a stagecoach in Boston a lifetime ago. And grandchildren. So many grandchildren that Rosalind sometimes lost count, which was itself a kind of wealth that would have been incomprehensible to the lonely girl who had packed a small trunk with 3 gray dresses and fled into the night. "Everett would want us to celebrate his life," Rosalind said, her voice steady despite the tears on her weathered cheeks. "He would want stories and laughter and too much whiskey. He would want us to remember him as he lived, not mourn him as he died." That night in the big house on Brennan Ridge, 3 generations gathered. They told stories about Everett, how he had found Rosalind bleeding on a mountain road and carried her through a storm, how he had delivered Rowan during a blizzard, turning a breech baby with scarred hands and iron will, how he had worked and fought and loved with equal intensity, holding nothing back, wasting nothing, giving everything. They laughed at his terrible jokes, at his legendary inability to cook anything more complex than coffee, at the way he had once chased a raccoon through the house at 3 in the morning, wearing nothing but his boots and carrying a broom. They cried for the man they had lost and the years they would not share with him, and the grandchildren he would never see grow into the people he had helped make possible. And they drank far too much whiskey, just as Everett would have wanted. Halfway through the evening, Rowan found his mother sitting alone on the porch, looking up at the stars the way Everett had always done after a long day, as if the answers to questions he never asked aloud were written in those cold, distant lights. "Are you all right, Mother?" Rosalind smiled at her firstborn. "I am sad. I will be sad for a long time. But I am also grateful. I had 40 years with him, Rowan. 40 years of love and partnership in building this life together. Not everyone gets that much. You changed him, you know. Rowan sat beside her, his large frame settling into the chair with the same quiet economy of movement that had characterized his father. I remember what he was like when I was very small, closed off, guarded, carrying all that grief about Lorelei and Ivy like a stone he could not set down. You taught him it was safe to love again. We taught each other, Rosalind said. All four of us. We were all broken in different ways when we found each other. We healed together. Orrin went next 5 years after Everett. A heart attack took him quickly, mercifully in the garden, where he had spent his later years growing vegetables and writing poetry, his two great passions finally united in a single peaceful pursuit. Rosalind found him there on a summer morning sitting in his chair, with his hands still wrapped around a pen, a half-finished verse about love and mountains and the way time changes everything except the things that matter, lying on the paper beside him. She read the unfinished poem and wept. Then she finished it for him, adding 2 lines in her own hand that said what she knew he had been trying to say. Briggs lasted the longest, though his mind began to wander in his final years, the sharp edges of memory softening and blurring, until past and present became interchangeable. He would sometimes call Rosalind by Marguerite's name, and she would answer to it without correction, because the name did not matter. What mattered was the love in his voice when he said it, the warmth in his eyes when he looked at her, the way his scarred hand still reached for hers whenever she entered the room. He died at 78 with Rosalind holding his hand and telling him stories about their life together. She told him about the wolves and the blizzard and the night he showed her his sketchbook. She told him about the baby and the battle and the spring that came late but came completely. She told him about 40 years of love that had started with suspicion and ended with absolute trust. She hoped he could hear her. She hoped he knew. Rosalind Hayes Dunhill lived to be 82 years old. In her final days, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren who filled the big house with noise and life in the particular chaos that large families generate, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. The frightened girl in a gray dress stealing money from a locked drawer. The stagecoach rattling westward through a country she had only imagined. The crash and the blood and the snow. The enormous man on the black horse lifting her from the road as if she weighed nothing. 3 men around a kitchen table, offering her a choice between the life she had been assigned and the life she might build. She thought about freedom, not the desperate escape she had been seeking when she left Boston. Not the absence of constraint that she had imagined freedom would be, but the deeper freedom she had found instead, the freedom to love without limits and without apology, to build a family on terms that no rulebook had anticipated, to be fully and completely herself in a world that had spent 24 years trying to force her into smaller shapes. On her last night with Rowan holding one hand and Marigold holding the other, Rosalind smiled at the faces gathered around her bed. There were so many of them, so much love concentrated in one room that the walls themselves seemed to expand to contain it. No regrets, she whispered. Not one. The woman they buried on Brennan Ridge beside the 3 men who had loved her and whom she had loved in return had been many things in her 82 years. Runaway, survivor, wife, mother, teacher, fighter, matriarch of a family that defied every convention of its time and proved that love, when it is genuine and brave and willing to be unconventional, can build something that outlasts the rules designed to prevent it. The words carved on her headstone were simple. They needed no elaboration, no explanation, no defense. Rosalind Hayes Dunhill, beloved, free. And every spring after that, wildflowers grew around her grave, pushing up through mountain soil that had once nearly claimed her life. Purple and yellow and white, they bloomed in abundance year after year, decade after decade, long after the last person who remembered her face had joined her beneath the earth. A testament to the stubborn, beautiful, unconquerable power of things that refuse to die. Because sometimes being ruined is just another word for being free. And sometimes a wrong turn on a mountain road leads exactly where you were always meant to go.